Dear respected scholars, distinguished guests, it is my pleasure on behalf of the International Foundation for Muslim Theology to welcome all of you from abroad and within the UK to the online seminar on Godtalk, Divine Communication and Revelation. In 2018, three like-minded people came together to think of ways of how to create space in our daily lives for God. It ought to be not just any space, and not space that was limited to a few minutes periodically. There had to be a way of being God conscious all the time, feeling that connection with the One on a constant basis, despite the overwhelming diversity and distraction in this world. A way that was not based on the distinction between the profane and the otherworldly, but a way that can show us that life is otherworldly in all of its aspects. The IFMT was founded on these grounds with projects on two different wings: the academic and the practical. While the academic wing comprises projects such as the translation of important theological texts from Arabic, Persian, and Turkish into English, and the writing of academic works that can hopefully serve as source books within the arena of speculative theology, the practical wing concentrates on the pastoral well-being of the Muslim laity and the delivery of God-centered knowledge and understanding through videos, podcasts, kinetic typographic presentations, etc. Focusing on the truths and realities of faith and God-centeredness, rather than on law, legal theory, and jurisprudence, we embarked on a journey with multiple facets, but one overarching aim: finding ways of bringing Godtalk back into the center of human conversation and life. It appeared to us that the most appropriate way of doing this would be to establish the foundations of our endeavor on 6 principles of faith and try to find solutions there. Divine Communication and Revelation, a Muslim theological perspective, is the first of a series of projects that the IFMT is planning to this end. The IFMT is very fortunate to be supported by organizations such as the John Templeton Foundation and the Q2Q Foundation, who believe in our cause and the importance thereof. This project was kickstarted in December 2020, and we have been working tirelessly ever since. Notwithstanding the fact that we did not have the opportunity and honor to meet our scholarly friends in person as initially planned, thanks to Corona, our workshop was held online at the end of May 2021. The goal of the workshop was to plan and landscape an academic volume comprising different scholarly approaches to various facets and aspects of divine communication and revelation. The volume would have 12 chapters and would combine the talents of Muslim theologians, philosophers, and scholars of Muslim law and legal theory from all over the world. Our scholars enthusiastically outlined their chapters, and discussions took place over 4 days, with the details of the multi-authored and multidisciplinary volume being examined carefully. A brief video snapshot of the workshop can be accessed on the IFMT homepage and YouTube channel. This current seminar may be slightly different from what you may be used to. We do not expect our scholars to give highly academic accounts of their chapters in this particular forum. However, if it is an academic lens you are looking for, you will be able to find that in the collaborative volume in which our scholars are contributing once it is published, inshallah. Instead, we have asked them to consider the following questions. Why do you think your chapter is necessary? How are the issues you have explored important for Muslims in general? And why are your findings and conclusions relevant pastorally? While at this seminar, guest attendees will be able to contribute by making use of the comments section on Zoom. Share your thoughts and ideas with us, as well as your questions. At the end of each talk, we will have a 15-minute question and answer session, and we'll try to comment on as many of your questions as possible. Your input is very important to us and may help us finesse our chapters. Please also note that this seminar is being recorded and will be available on IFMT's website as well as YouTube channel after the seminar. A wholehearted welcome again to everyone. And without further ado, I would like to pass the flag on to Dr. Mashid Turner, who will be chairing our first session.
Assalamu alaikum. I've pinched Colin's computer to chair for this session. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome everyone to our first session on the seminar on Godtalk and Divine Communication and Revelation. I am Mashid Turner, co-director for International Foundation for Muslim Theology. And as Tubane said, I will be chairing this first session. I will also be reading out any questions in the QA and chat box at the end of every talk. So I welcome our speakers for this morning's session, Dr. Mehmet Ozal, Dr. Bilal Ansari, and Dr. Safaruk Chowdhury, who will briefly introduce themselves, who they are, what they do, and where they are based before giving their talk. So it's over to you, Dr. Mehmet Ozal.
Thank you to Banur and Mashid for the introductory comments and introduction. My name is Mehmet Ozal, Associate Professor Mehmet Ozal at Charles Sturt University in Australia. I am the Director of Center for Islamic Studies and Civilization. I'm also the founder and Executive Director of Islamic Sciences and Research Academy, which is a community organization in Australia. We are based in Sydney and Melbourne, and we want to raise, well, our aim is to raise the level of high-level Islamic learning in Australia. Now, I'll share my screen. I have some slides. The title of my presentation is God's Universal Communication with Creation and Four Types of God's Revelation in the Quranic Framework. When we talk about revelation, which is wahi in Arabic, we generally understand it as God's revelation and communication to human beings through prophets of Allah, prophets of God, and these come in the form of books, and Quran being one of them. Now, obviously, this is the case because the Quran itself talks about Allah or God sending wahi through the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and many other prophets. The problem with this, this is a bit of a rather narrow understanding of wahi, and it's actually possible to extend the Quranic understanding or Quranic expression of God revealing himself to and through creation. And hopefully this will help us understand Quran better. And I will come to the significance of why this is important. But one of the key things that this produces is that it creates a dualistic mindset amongst Muslims, which is un-Islamic. Actually, it's a product of modernity, and as in, Muslims tend to think, oh, this is Quran, the realm of religion, and then the natural world, the realm of philosophy, science, which is alien to Islam, and we create this dualistic understanding of the world, and that also sometimes affects, or not sometimes, often affects our behaviors as well. We tend to compartmentalize our behavior. This is religious, I'm praying, and sometimes people do unethical things, thinking that that's not part of the religion, or it's the normal world, operating in a normal world where religion is not dominant. So this dualistic mindset and behaviors is a problem, in my view, which reflects itself even in the way we see education as well. So hopefully, I'm hoping that a broader understanding of what revelation is as God's communication to and through his creation will help us solve that problem. Now, the logical underpinning of my argument is this. I'll just put it on this slide. Basically, well, one of the problems that we have is that our scholars in the past did not really understand revelation in a very, very broad term. So I have to lay the foundation of that. And that's what the entire purpose of this, my chapter will be in the book. So basically, it starts with the well-known premise, number one, Wahi is God's speech and communication to human beings through messengers of God, of course. Like you can expand each of these, but that Allah speaks to human beings through prophets. And the two, that if God speaks and communicates with creation other than human beings, then God communicates with entire creation. So if we can show that in Quran demonstrates that God speaks to creation other than human beings, then we have narrowly understood Wahi. And then the premise number three there is God speaks and communicates with creation other than human beings, which I shall illustrate the truth of that third premise there, which is the key to the entire argument. And then we show, then it follows that God communicates with entire creation. And if we combine 1 and 4, then we get that our overall conclusion is that Wahi is communication with human beings and the entire creation. And that is the ultimate conclusion that I want to get to as a result of my research and the writing of the chapter. The significance of this study is that it will enable us to appreciate Quran in a broad sense. You know, Quran, we see as Muslims and believers, we see Quran as this source of a treasure troves of knowledge and wisdom, but yet we limit its meanings. So hopefully this is an example of appreciating Quran in a far more broader sense. This will also improve our understanding of God's relationship with and governance in the universe. Like we say, as Muslims believe that God creates the entire creation and he governs it. But how? How does he do that? And obviously, I'm not going to go into the entire cosmology, but I feel that God's speaking and communicating with creation is a very important element of God's creation and sustaining of the universe, and it gives us clues on how that operates beyond the three dimensions of existence. And also, more importantly, we see the world as a place where God speaks through his creation. This will help hopefully end the duality of science and religion in the mind of believers, and also better appreciation of the natural environment. If we see the universe, the world, the creatures in it, the living plants and animals, as a book, or like as a book of revelation that God speaks to and through, and then we respect that creation, and hence there will be a religious motive to preserve the environment, and Muslims should be acting to address the climate change. I actually wrote an article, an op-ed during the COP26, where I argued that Muslims should be part of the conversation, and then we were missing in that. I don't want to digress, but so this is the main significance, or one of the significance of this research, and this addressing the God of the gaps objection, which kind of atheists or usually scientific that use science kind of say that, oh, well, people believe in God because they cannot explain. There are gaps in our explanations. And if we can explain things through science, then you no longer need God. So this is a major objection of people, irreligious people or atheistic people make. So I guess the arguments that we have in this project, the entire project, and in my chapter, hopefully will help address that problem. So God is the God of Islam is not God of the gaps, but God of the entire creation, irrespective of how we explain and how we understand the creation to be. Now, to build my argument, I'm using 5 key ideas from Said Nursi. For those of you who may not know Said Nursi, he's a Kurdish ethnic, but he lived in Turkey from late Ottoman era and early modern Turkey. He was a major scholar in that period, and he wrote from 1925 to 1960 major theological works, and which I feel is very significant in many respects as modern theological commentary on the Quran. Now, the first one is the obvious one, that God speaks to human beings through messengers of God. But Nursi puts a very nice and impeccable logical flow where, in a nutshell, he says God speaks because God has knowledge. He creates with knowledge. And the one who knows and the one who speaks will speak to a conscious being, and that amongst conscious beings, he will speak to human beings who are the most comprehensive of all conscious beings, and amongst them, he will speak to the ones that will represent God's message in the best possible ways, and they are the illustrious chain of prophets, including Prophet Muhammad. So that is very much within, obviously, the framework that I'm trying to build, that God's speaking through to human beings through revelation. The second interesting thing is in relation to major archangels. Well, my topic is not angels, but I think this is important in that, at least when I read it, it really expanded my understanding of God's revelation. So basically, when Nursi was explaining the function of the 4 archangels, he was saying that they represent wahi, like life-giving, life-taking, and provision of sustenance, like 4 fundamental acts of God's rububiyyah. And here, the communication or God speaking to his creation, Jibril represents that. So if Jibril represents the entire act of God communicating to his creation, so therefore the God wahi cannot be just what is revealed to prophets. So it needs to be more than that.
You have another 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Mashid. Time flies. And there are 2, and the third idea that Nursi makes is that there are 2 types of revelation, and that's revelation to messengers, and then inspiration to human heart. And he makes this distinction. He gives an analogy of, let's say, a king speaking to all of his subjects, and if he wanted to do that, he would appoint a special envoy. He would give him a decree, an official decree, and then this envoy would go from town to town, basically broadcast that message from the king into entire nation. So that is like the revelation given, wahi given to a prophet. But then he says that the king may address a particular personal issue of one individual, and in that case, he just has to pick up the phone, ring him up, and address that. Nobody else has to know. And that is the inspirational given to human heart. So basically what he's saying is that we all receive God's communication, which is more personal, more indirect, or doesn't have to come with bells and whistles. So this is also, this really opened my eyes when I read that, or my understanding, I should say, that, well, if God speaks to messengers and human beings, well, why not the rest of the creation? And we get also 2 additional ideas from him. The fourth one here is that, so God revelation through universe is a book of creation. So he says that there is Sharia is actually 2. There's one Sharia, but it has 2 parts. One is the Sharia al-Qur'aniyya, which is the revelation that, or God's commandments that we get from commandments and prohibitions that we get from the Quran. But then there's also Sharia al-Takwiniyya, which is the God's laws in the creation. So if we're talking about laws here, then you get laws from the Quran and laws from the creation to universe, and they're both to be read. They're both books of revelation, but of different kind. One expressed purely in language, the other one is expressed through the universe, through living beings. So this enables us to think that what the natural laws that may exist in the universe, what we call natural laws, are actually God's revelation, God's communication to the entire creation. And finally, last one is that God's speech or kalam is limitless, just as his knowledge and power are limitless. So and that's because kalam, like as scholars said, that is an attribute of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it's an attribute of God. So it's always there. It was always there before. It will always be there. The attributes do not start and finish. So why limit the kalam or speech of God to only the revelation in books? Because they're finite at the end of the day. Yes, maybe infinite meanings are conveyed, but nevertheless, the words actually are finite. And the evidence for this view is that God's speech is limitless is this verse from the Quran, 31:27 and 18:109. If all the trees of the earth were pens and the whole sea were ink, and 7 more seas added, then the words of God would not be exhausted in writing. So we usually think, when we read this verse, we think that, oh, okay, this is just a possibility if it happened. But what Nursi says is that, well, this actually is happening, that God is speaking through creation, and basically all information we have in the universe could be the God speaking, or what these verses are talking about. I'm running out of time, but I won't go in detail, but just very briefly. So the Quranic basis of all of these 4 types of revelation can be based in the Quran. Like this prophetic revelation is one type. Then there's inspiration to human heart is also mentioned in the Quran. We have animal instincts, like the word wahi is used in relation to the bees. So basically we can generalize it. Obviously, the Quran is not going to say, mention all of the instincts of animals, but this is just an example that what we see, these amazing behaviors from animals, are actually God revealing and guiding these animals. And also God speaking to inanimate objects. And here, a couple of examples, like God speaking to heaven and earth, and they are not. We know that they're not living beings, and there's a communication taking place. And the earthquake is mentioned as God revealed to the earth. So these are clues, direct evidence from the Quran that proves the truth that God speaks to his entire creation, and therefore, we can make my overall conclusion that revelation, wahi, is God's communication to and through his creation as a reflection of his lordship. Thank you very much. I'm not sure if Mashid is there.
Your microphone is unmute. Can you mute it, please? Mashid.
Yeah, just trying to unmute. Okay. Right, we're going to have 15 minutes break. So we'll be back at 11:45.
There's no Q&A.
Oh, sorry. No, we're going to have question and answers 15 minutes first. Sorry about that. Yeah.
No worries.
Chat. Are there any questions? I can't see any in the chat box. So I don't know if the panel want to ask.
I think Timothy has raised his hand, Mashid.
Okay. Yeah. Well, go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much, Brother Mehmet, for that really interesting and I think in some ways challenging presentation. Question that I have is, if we're going to embrace this larger concept of divine speech, and if indeed we see the entirety of the creation as the theater of divine communication, I'm wondering if you're going to need to come to a position on the eternality or the the pre-eternity of divine speech. In other words, the createdness or the uncreatedness of the divine speech. Because if we're going to, take this seriously and see the creation as really the primordial book, and I think that's absolutely the correct position to take, then what do we do with this question of the createdness or the uncreatedness of divine speech? Is this an attribute that has eternally been with God even before the creation, or is this an attribute that God creates as a mode through which God then relates to the creation? And I think that the implications, I know that this was a burning medieval debate with the Mu'tazilites and others, but I think it does have interesting implications for interpretation and contextualization of that divine speech. And so I'm wondering if that's a question that you've considered in your your research and your writing.
In this particular, thank you, Tim. I appreciate it. A very excellent question, and I haven't really discussed that in the chapter that I'm working on, but it is a valid question, an excellent one, and I would say that similar to the attribute of tekwin, in the Ash'ari and Maturidi theological schools, as you may know, that there was a debate between the two scholars and theologians, that the Maturidi theologians argued that there is an attribute called tekwin, which is God giving existence to things, and that existence, giving existence to things which are temporal in and of themselves. So those things did not really exist before, and then now they exist, and that happens. Nursi talks about two types of creation. I'm going to compare this to the speech aspect. That's why maybe it's analogous, the two, I believe. So Said Nursi says that there are two types of creation, like one from nothing, and then there is creation from the things that already exist, which is insha. And this is actually Quranic. In the Quran, it also says that God creates and then repeats his creation. So if obviously the Ash'ari scholars didn't like the attribute of tekwin, because it would then lead to the understanding that, or the conclusion that, or possible conclusion that created things, the things that we see around us, would have some eternity, because the attributes are eternal. But there is a resolution to that. The resolution is that there's a difference between the attribute and the effects of attributes, and what we call ta'alluqat, which is the connection of attribute to the effect of that attribute. So the effect and the connection, the relationship, are temporal. They're not eternal, but the attribute is. So by the same token, we can really apply by analogy the attribute of kalam. Like if, and by the way, the Ash'ari solution to the problem or this issue is that there is no attribute of tekwin, but God says kun, and be, and it is. So they take it to the kalam side, which is an attribute as well, So I don't know how why they do that, but it doesn't really solve the problem from an Ash'ari thinking. But it really comes down to what I was saying, that, so yeah, the God's speech is, as an attribute, is permanent or eternal, let's say, but God is always speaking, and the effects of that speech on created beings are temporal. They're not permanent, or sorry, they're not eternal. Now, otherwise, yeah, we would go to the conclusion that the entire universe is eternal, and clearly not. You know, things begin to exist and they die and they disintegrate and things like that. I don't know. Does it make sense? It's maybe from an Islamic theological perspective, it kind of.
No, thank you. I just, you know, it seems to me that somehow, some way, it's you know, it's a relevant it's a relevant aspect of you know, whenever we're talking about divine communication and the, you know, the nature of the attributes, you know, it's something that we can't fully escape. But I don't think that this is a question that our tradition has satisfactorily resolved. And so I think it continues to be a somewhat vexing question for us. In some ways, it's kind of the Muslim Christological problem, because if we have, you know, if we have an uncreated book that's not exactly God, and yet it's not God, it's not separate from God, then we're dealing with a kind of Quranic version of a Christological problem that we can't quite you know, that we can't quite resolve. And so, and if we expand that notion of you know, divine communication, and we include the creation in that, then it raises all kinds of tricky questions. But I don't think that those questions get in the way at all of your more pastoral, you know, the pastoral implications. That is the sacredness of the creation, and the, you know, I think that I like the way you've connected it to real challenges and real problems that we're facing, and the you know, the very generative and pastoral implications of what you're, you know, this theoretical discourse. So I like that part, but I'm not sure we'll ever resolve.
Sorry to interrupt you, but
Yeah.
I want everyone to have a short break.
Sorry.
Obviously, we're going to have more discussion on this. It's a very interesting question. But I do have another question before the break. I've got to read out in the chat box. It says, at the beginning, it was mentioned about a dualistic view, religion versus science, reflecting into education as well. I understand my question might be beyond the scope of Dr. Mehmet Ozalp's research, but how practically does he suggest to address this in the educational system?
Well, very quickly, the biggest issue, as soon as modernity hit the Muslim world with Napoleon's invasion of Egypt, it created a huge, and also Ottomans losing some of the battles in Europe. You know, they did a study and they said, well, we're not advanced enough. We need more advanced military. But they looked at the education system. They had madrasas, which were not teaching science at all. So they established these mektabs as an alternative education system where science, or more profane, the worldly sciences would be taught. And that created, those two educational systems created societies in the Muslim world that are they have diametrically opposite vision for society, and we're still suffering from that. The latest being, you know, the Afghanistan. You know, you had Taliban, and before that, you know, it was a modern liberal democracy. So we tend to go to and fro to these extremes, and at the heart of that lies seeing not having a unified education system. So I guess one solution is that we build an education philosophy where religion and science is taught, was not just as a convenience, as a utility of, but with deep down there's a theological basis, that there's a belief that knowledge is one, and that, like, studying science is not un-Islamic or some Western concoction into the Western world or something like that. I think we have really huge problems in these areas, and the solution is to unify education philosophy between science and religion.
Thank you for that. We have one comment and we have 1 minute to respond if you wish. Tazani says that the Quran is eternal. The self-talk part of the Quran is eternal, but the letters of the Quran, the arrangements of sentences and writing materials have been created. So we're talking about the two aspects.
Yeah, the scholars, like theologians, always make that distinction, like kalam binafsi, kalam bilafsi aspect. But really the problem, the reason why this became controversy, like Quran is not created or not created. Even the Sunni scholars who said Quran is not created, they know and that the Quran that you hold in your hand is created. That what they mean is that the Quran as speech of God is not created. Like God does not create his own speech. He speaks through his attribute. So, but this is so complex and hard to understand that at the ordinary Muslim level, so they simplify it. So I don't think we should, if we're really worried about this, we should study what scholars are saying rather than the simplified version that we are told to ordinary Muslims. There's a dramatic difference.
Greetings, everybody. I am happy to be here. My name is Bilal. I am the son of Usama Ansari from the first resurrection of the Nation of Islam in the United States of America. My father came to Orthodox Islam in 1975 under the leadership of Imam like Muhammad, and I'm just a proud son of my father. And so I happen to be the director now of the Islamic chaplaincy program at Hartford International University for Religion and Peace. Don't say that without having a deep breath. But it's all about the training of like chaplains. I myself have been a chaplain within the prison systems for 16 years, served on a military base for 3 years. I've served in level 4 medical units, and now I've been at a college. I'm assistant vice president that has to care over other chaplains for the past 12 years. So that's a little bit about myself. Let me share my screen, if you wish, if you may. Patience with me. This is from a prophetic narration from our prophet Muhammad, you know, prayers and peace be upon him, where he said every prophet was a shepherd. And the question came back to him, were you a shepherd too? Yes, I was a shepherd too. And so this idea, my chapter is just about explicating what this means for us in this postmodern context. And in particular for me as a chaplain and a teacher of other like chaplains, and I use this idea to form a Muslim pastoral like theology. And what I want you to understand is that the final prophet is always necessary for navigation. Understand this, that somehow in our postmodern context, we have turned away from seeing our prophet within particularly the pastoral, theological lens as being a shepherd, a guide for humanity until the end of times. I am talking directly to a community of pastoral, like the theologians within the United States who have created a clinical pastoral training for chaplains who have to give care to those Muslims within institutions, whether they're in a prison, whether they're in the military, whether they're in a hospital. I am positing this argument because there's scholars who have stated, both on the Muslim side and on the Christian side, that Muslims do not have a pastoral care in their tradition. Our tradition is not one of all that pastoral care. They have reduced it down in the postmodern way of saying we just have a spiritual care, and they don't see that the Prophet Muhammad as a final prophet is necessary for navigation, even in a scene as complex and convoluted as our world that we live in today. But he is necessary, and I'm going to explain why. There's 2 chapters in the Quran where the word ra'un, shepherd, is employed, is used as, and the one of the chapters is the chapter called the believers. In the first 11 ayats, it describes the characteristics, the attributes of a believer. And one of those attributes that is a summation of the ones before and everything afterward is that the believers are ra'un of their trust and their covenant. And so this ayah is repeated in the same way in surah, in the believers and the ascension, and the surah of the ways of the ways of ascension. The same ayat is used in the same, like 11 ayats describing what a believer is in the world. And in essence, our job in the world is to be ra'un, is to be a shepherd over our trust and our covenant, our trust to God, and our care over the creation of God. And our final prophet was a shepherd like every other prophet. If his words are true for us, then we have to understand his role pastorally, his role as a pastoral caregiver, his role as a pastoral care provider. And we have to ask ourselves as caregivers, as chaplains working within institutions, I challenge my students to keep the trust and to guard over the covenant. And that is that in our theology, both in our speculative, but I say, if you look at there is a pastoral purpose and aim of every every theological school. Those theologians were responding to a communal concern, to a challenge, to the tradition, to the understanding of and meanings of what the revelation means. And so pastorally, they were responding as the shepherd of their trust as scholars. And they were keeping the covenant of following the final messenger as being the one who has the most meaningful and relevant guidance for us through any problem, in any time, in any place, and under all circumstances. He is our ra'un. And theologically, all things rest on this idea that in our methodologies and our techniques and our practices of care and care seeking, we have to always affirm and not confute the prophet as our shepherd. We cannot deny his role as a shepherd and how we care for those who we are given the responsibility of to care for. In my chapter, I give a case study of a prison case when there's a young man who's in prison, and he was the head of a Latin King gang, and he converted, to Islam. MashaAllah, alhamdulillah. He was upset because in his unit there was another Muslim who was the Arabic teacher, but who was struggling with homosexual practices. And he wanted me to excommunicate this Muslim. And he said, if I did not do that, then he was going to practice what's called locks and socks, meaning he was going to take 3 locks and put them in 3 socks. And while the individual is sleeping, hold him down with bed sheets and beat him like the Quran revealed with lutes, raining stones. He was going to rain locks and socks, following what he understood as the revelation. And it was a challenge. What are you going to do? And so I had to pastorally look through our legal tradition and guide. I had to pastorally center the Prophet Muhammad as Rahmatul Alameen and guide. I had to pastorally look at the diseases in his heart and excessive anger in his heart and guide him to a more balanced way, a more middle way, a more on the straight path. Because as we know, the Quran says that the Shaitan, he's come to disrupt us even on the straight path. So you can have the best intentions you think, but you have to watch out for even being misguided. And so the pastoral caregiver is doing this guidance through our legal tradition.
So you have another 5 minutes.
Through our theological tradition and through our spiritual care tradition. And we're centering the prophet as our shepherd. I want to caution us that spiritual care can be a flashlight. It can help us from point A to point B, but pastoral care is about the divine light. It is about living right, being a shepherd over your trust and your covenant to God. So like Mehmet said, so that revelation can be revealed to your heart, so that there'll be a light placed in your heart. Because if you look at the speculative theologies, they say all of this matters not if you don't end up with a qalbin salim, if there's not a light that Allah doesn't place in your heart to guide. And that divine light is only if you follow and keep to the final shepherd, Prophet Muhammad, as the source and of your finding divine light, despite having spiritual care as a flashlight in dark places. We are not led by external lights. We are led by lights that Allah Ta'ala places on our hearts. And so, in conclusion, it is always pastorally relevant to see our final Prophet Muhammad as a shepherd, and to look at our Quran as through the lens as 25 stories of shepherds. And what those shepherding stories tell us about care. And this is why when you have the 13th word in Saeed Nursi, when he's giving pastoral counseling and care to the people in the prison, he used the Quranic story and made that prison into a school of Yusuf, and turned their vision. And he was a pastoral theologian in that environment. Don't think about this as a prison. This is a means for you to increase your worship and have an internal success that is the ultimately best navigation in this dark place, centering our prophetic message, centering our Quranic message, and being a pastoral caregiver in the darkest of places. Thank you very much. Every prophet was a shepherd. And my chapter is just a way of thinking about it as a Muslim pastoral theology.
Thank you so much for that very interesting talk. As a Muslim chaplain also, I very much think, oh, you've got your stick as well. Yeah. As a Muslim chaplain, I also believe that, can you hear me? Oh,
yes.
Yeah. I have also came across this statement that, you know, there's no pastoral care in Islam. That this is just not. Quran is full of statements which supports the idea of pastoral care, and one of them, you know, two of the words that come all the time in the Quran is amal saleh, righteous deeds. So we are all meant to follow our prophet in doing righteous deeds. So that is itself pastoral care. And there is so much in the sunnah of our prophet, peace be upon him, that we have to also follow. That's all about pastoral care. So I don't know how how they justify that statement. Thank you very much for that. I'm just going to have a look in the chat box to see if there's anyone else who's made a statement. Okay, we have a question here. Dr. Ansari, will your study involve also research into the Prophet's, peace be upon him, moral, social, and emotional intra and interpersonal intelligence with direct examples from his life?
Yes. So I am looking at all of those elements through a particular case like study of caring for some this individual within the prison. And so I pull out all of those aspects. What are the social logical factors? What are the psychological factors that are going on, and I give elements of how to care through, but I'm using Quranic narratives of our prophets. I don't focus primarily on the Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam story, but I give some references to it because I'm trying to I'm using a particular these are particular verses that deal with encouragement to our Prophet Muhammad about there were prophets before you who were denied, and so there's 7 prophets that are mentioned in the surah on surah on the pilgrimage. There's 7 verses in there that when the prophet is encouraged that other prophets were also denied, and remember Noah, remember Hud, remember Salih, remember Ibrahim, remember Lut, and also Musa. And so I primarily focus on the pastoral elements within those 7 because my problem is the denial, and so I'm focusing on why we should not deny our Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his pastoral role as a shepherd.
Thanks for that. I think Saf has a question.
I think Tubanu might have been first, Mashid. I think,
sorry, yeah. Which one of you? Tubanu, were you first? Did you want to go?
Yeah, that's okay. Actually, Brother Bilal, thank you very much for your talk. I am wondering, there is a surah in the Quran, Surah Baqarah, ayat 104, where it says, "O you who believe, do not say Ra'ina, heard us, but say Unthurna, look upon us." And that verse struck me as particularly interesting, as it tells us not to let ourselves to be herded, both by our Creator or by anyone else, but it is because it is animals that are being herded and act solely upon reward and punishment. So asking to be heard, it means, being ready to hand over critical thinking, or in fact, any thinking at all. That's how I understand it. But it is okay, for example, on the other hand, to say, look upon us, umthurna, which bears the meaning of accepting one's poverty and need, and asking one's creator to always and constantly guide and help, and suggest to be ready to take on responsibility. So I would like to hear what's your take on this.
Well, I'm so glad you brought that up. Thank you, my sister. Tubanor. Yeah, that comes in two places in the Quran, actually, where that is mentioned. And that is in a particular the asbabul nuzul around that, the actual reasoning for that or revelation is because the Sahabas were calling the prophet as that, to overlook us, to oversee us, to see us. That was actually a normative way of referring to the prophet. But the Jewish community, when they migrated to Medina, they had a similar word within their language that they were using it because it meant something very like negative, and so they were saying it to really put the prophet down, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, without him knowing, and so Allah knows, and so Allah says he changed it, and so he used to look after, he used the same meaning of the same meaning, but he just changed it to another word for look after to mean the same thing. And this idea of not wanting to be hurting, oh, that was a good one there. Not that's a good way, not wanting to be hurted. We have in our tradition, Allah's hand is over the Jamaat. So there is a sense of collectiveness, of communal blessing within a herd, and so there is nothing wrong with being a part of a consensus, a majlis, a shura, bainahum, take it all together. This is very much a part of our tradition, the herd. The whole idea of the concept of having your opinions be a part of an ijma', whether it's a part of a scholarly ijma or one of a community, it's still a herd thing. And so I'm not afraid of the herd. I just don't want to be unheard as a part of the herd. You feel me? That's it. You can herd me all day, but you better hear me. And so that's it. And I think as long as we are hearing our messenger, we can be herded.
Thank you for that, Saf.
Jazakallah khairan, Sidi Bilal. Amazing as always, man. It's this energy that we need, and alhamdulillah, and advice as well. I mean, as you know, as you mentioned, I also find it very difficult why people can deny pastoral care. And if we take the common sort of modern terms of pastoral care, might include listening, encouraging, practically helping, and praying, but also comforting. And we have in the Islamic, we have a genre of literature, tasliyatul musab, so consoling the grief-stricken. So we have many books on that. As-Suyuti wrote Bushra al-Ka'ib, li liqa' al-Habib, fi liqa' al-Habib. So the ulama understood there was a need to bring advice, categories of value to people who are stricken, whatever that might be, whether it's through disability or death, bereavement, whatever. So it's there to be mined. So yeah, I think alhamdulillah, this stuff is it's amazing, and I can't wait till it explodes. I can't wait to explode on the scene.
Alhamdulillah. Yeah, no, I think it's just it is like Imam Ali, may Allah be pleased with it, and over light in his face, said that like I just turned you're like 50, and I've been mulling this over for like 25 years, And he says that youth is like sickness, and the only cure is to get old, you know, to get older. And so I think I was like a wandering sheep or goat, but I really believe that the time through age, I really see that this is really like relevant, for our time.
Thank you. I think Saf probably Saf's comment probably answers Yasmin's question, but I will read it out anyway. She says, "Thank you very much for your presentation. My question pertains to the more practical side of pastoral care, since as far as I'm aware, pastoral care is a new thing. I always thought it would be a Christian social structure. How do you go to practice pastoral care in reality? Do you take the Christian social structures of care and transform them into an Islamic version, or is it something totally new?"
No, I really believe, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think within our tradition, the first pastoral care moment was of our mother, when the Prophet Muhammad first received the revelation. That moment of like Zambiluni, wrap me, was the first pastoral care moment within our tradition. And then what did she do? She wrapped him. And what pastoral counseling did she offer him? She affirmed his identity, his conduct, his pastoral skills and abilities, and his purpose and his aim in the world. You are not what you are imagining to be. You are greater than that. You do this, you do that, you take care of the orphan. This pastoral counseling by our mother. And then what did she do? She referred him out. Who did she refer him out to? She referred him to a Christian. So there was a deep pastoral counseling, pastoral care at the very outset. And I argue that the angel was also a pastoral caregiver to our Prophet Muhammad, constantly consoling him, coming to him. He was also a pastoral counselor to the community. The hadith, when he came with the all black hair and all white and being rude and you're stepping over folks and sitting right next to the Prophet, who was that? What did he ask? That was a pastoral care movement for the whole community. Pastoral care is infused into the very fabric of our tradition. And this is when you understand intimately why every prophet was a shepherd by the words of our Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and that I too was a shepherd. That cannot be ignored. There is a postmodern move to get rid of that concept for spiritual care. And it sounds good because we do have a spiritual care tradition, but according to that hadith, it is a part of four. It is what is Islam, what is Iman, what is Ihsan. Ihsan is one of four, and then there's the eschatological end. Give me some signs of the end of time. And what does he say there? What does he say about he said there'll be shepherds. So the whole flipping of the paradigm of the shepherds, there'll be shepherds racing each other to build tall buildings. So total flip of the social psychology will be totally flipped in our day. But the shepherds is even mentioned in that hadith, that central hadith. And so I argue pastoral care is ours.
I'm totally with you. Thank you for that, Bilal. I think every word in the Quran indicates pastoral care. I would go as far as that, and I would go as far as say that we're all meant to be a shepherd. And I would say that because if you think of the word Rab in itself, in the Quran is about tarbiyah, about sustaining, nurturing, nourishing, educating. So we are all supposed to be engaged in that tarbiyah. And if you talk about the word just, idalat is about balance, mizan, and making sure that everything's in its right place. So the Quran is full of, was all about pastoral care.
Wait a minute, you read my chapter already?
No, it's
Did you
just
have a
being a
sneak peek?
chaplain. I couldn't really got into this because as being a chaplain, I've kind of really argued with that as well. I now pass over to Dr. Saf Chowdhury.
Thank you, Mashid. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I'm Saf Chowdhury. I'm currently a researcher at the Cambridge Muslim College. And my research subject area is Analytic Epistemology. So that's just looking at the theory of knowledge from the Islamic perspective, but try and apply some of the tools and machinery of the analytic tradition, the analytic philosophy tradition. That's often the philosophy that's done in the departments in America and Europe, England, America, and Europe. So they call it Anglo-American philosophy. I have a philosophy background and a Sharia background, and so I'm really happy to be amongst everyone, and it's really been brilliant and stimulating this first session. Let me just jump straight into it, because I know this might be a bit of a challenging topic, but before I do that, let me just say I apologize for the noise in the background, because we're in the middle of a storm, so you might hear some battering on the window. But you might also hear a little storm of my son storming into the room, creating whirlwinds. But inshallah, we hope he's calm. But unfortunately, there's going to be a lot of noise in the background. So alhamdulillah, as long as everyone's safe, that's the important thing. Okay, right. So the topic of my chapter, the topic that I went for was an easy one. A very easy one, and that's the topic of free will and divine foreknowledge. So what I wanted to do in this chapter is to try and say, okay, we know that the free will problem in Islamic theology is one of the most protracted problems. So the free will problem is sometimes known as theological fatalism or theological determinism. And what that means is, okay, if God knows beforehand what we're going to do, to what extent are we genuinely and truly free? So either we are genuinely and truly free, or God doesn't, we have to constrain God's knowledge or power. So something has to, or God has maximal knowledge and power, or we're not absolutely free. So something's got to give, and that's the conundrum Muslim scholars from the beginning of the 2nd century, in fact, probably even earlier, were contending with. And so my chapter explores a way of trying to understand and talk about the divine that admits of a contradiction, a logical contradiction. And a logical contradiction is just generally a statement of the form affirming something, so something is the case, but then at the same time denying it, so something is not the case. And symbolically, you can make, I hope you can see the slide. So symbolically, you can see P and not P. So you affirm a statement and you deny the affirmation of that statement at the same time. So in my chapter, I explore, can the conundrum of God and free will be solved by embracing the conjunction of God's knowledge and power and human free will? That conjunction, embracing that as a contradiction, would that be something acceptable in the theology, or should that be a direction that we can explore when it comes to thinking, talking, and discoursing about the divine? So essentially, that's the case study of my chapter. Okay, so why the reason for this topic? Well, I guess I want to explore how a theology that allows contradiction as exceptions, or that entertains contradictions as a possibility, how might that look? So if we were to set it out, what would be the implications, what would be the contours, what would be the axioms of that theology? So I want to look at that and especially if we're looking at divine attributes and divine actions, how would a theology that allows for contradictory, or gluts is just another term for a contradiction. So what would that theology look like? So that's what I want to explore, but through a case study. And the case study, as I mentioned, I'm exploring is divine free will and divine knowledge. The other reason, I guess, there are lots of reasons, but just I'm just mentioning two. The other reason, I guess, is I want to carve out of space, just like other people are doing as well, a couple of other people. I want to try and carve out a space where logic and the divine, the intersection between the two, what spills out from that intersection. So if we were to apply logic to the divine, whichever system of logic, because anyone who perhaps has a background in philosophy or in logic, or even in computer science, will know that there are different models of logic. So what would that look like if logical analysis was applied to the divine? What would be the implications of that? So I guess one is explorative and speculative, you could say, and the other is to sort of see what kind of space then we can make for a logical relation between a logical application to studying the divine. So what's the relevance then for the community, before I go on to talk about what the actual problem is and what solution I'm proposing in a bit more detail? So how would this contradictory type theology, this glut theoretic theology, how will that be relevant for the community, whether that's an academic community or just our general community? Well, I guess one significance may be to reconceptualize the divine from sort of mere neat and binary categories or paraphrases. You see, much of the theology that Muslims are either study or are aware of is either theology that is very like rationalist and scholastic, where you use reason and dialectic and argumentation and so on, and use logic as well. And this is the science of ilmul kalam, or the science of rational theology or scholastic theology, however you want to translate that. And then the other is what's known as traditionalist theology that is led more by scripture, but not led by sort of principles of scholastic theology like reason and logic. So scriptural theology and rational theology are sort of the two main methods by which theology is done and learned. And these theologies aim for what we call a consistentizing project, i.e. they're trying to make everything cohere nicely in such a way where you eliminate any kind of paradox or contradiction. So their project is to be consistent. So this kind of approach, a theology that embraces contradiction, would be a kind of move away from or reconceptualization of this kind of theology that is consistentizing, that's aiming to just cohere and eliminate any logical contradiction. So there's a reconceptualization of the divine then, from that kind of traditional way of theological framing. Another significance could be that, you know, internalizing awe of Allah Azza wa Jalla through surrendering to paradox and mystery. Of course, contradiction is stronger than paradox if you don't want to take them in the same way, but you're surrendering to something which you're just submitting and saying there is no, you know, it's not a way from, I cannot understand the divine by merely, I have to embrace the divine. As part of the divine truth is to embrace contradiction. Part of the divine truth is to embrace paradox or mystery or ineffability, which I'm not talking about ineffability today. Ineffability is that God is just beyond any, is just not knowable in any sense. So there's a significant way of internalizing submission to God in a way that one surrenders to God being just, you know, discursively beyond any kind of discursive activity. Another significance could be to acknowledge that theology, as I mentioned, may not always be consistent. We have to have humility and accept that there may be inconsistent elements in the theology, and that doesn't make the theology false. That just means, you know, I cannot make it logically cohere. I cannot make it logically cohere. But if we embrace a logic that allows contradiction, then in effect, and this is sort of the last point, we can't be accused of being irrational, because there's no violation of logic if your logical system allows for contradictions in the first place. So if your logical system allows for both true and false, then if that is a possibility to entertain in the theology, then you're not being illogical, not by that logic anyway. So I guess there is some kind of major radical reconfiguring of one's understanding and conceptualization of the divine. So there is some spillover here that I haven't worked out, I'll be honest, and it's something that I'm sort of working through myself. Okay, so what's the problem specifically, going back to the issue, topic of the paper, and what's the solution? As I mentioned a bit more formally, the problem then is that if God is omniscient, then God knows the future, and if God knows the future, then the future is fixed. If the future is fixed, then we can't do anything other than what we do. If we can't do anything other than what we do, then we are not truly free. And therefore, if God knows everything and is, you know, is powerful and could do anything, then we're not truly free. But if we, and the converse is that if we are truly free, then something has to give when it comes to divine omniscience or divine power. So if we're truly free, God can't stop us from doing our act. Or if we're really truly free, then something about divine knowledge, there has to be some constraint on divine knowledge. And this is what happens, you know, traditionally. If you look at all the solutions that are given, the traditional solutions to this problem either come from above, as I mentioned, or come from below. The above maneuver is from the God's eye perspective, and the below maneuver is from the creaturely perspective, the human perspective. So the traditional solutions that take the above solution or maneuver, they uphold God's omniscience and power, maximal omniscience, maximal power. So that entails we are not free. So God makes you do what you do, and he knows exactly what you're going to do. And if he knows exactly what you're going to do, and he makes you do what you do, then you're not free. Tough. You're determined. So that's one spectrum of the view. The other spectrum of the view is to go from below. So below is the view that, okay, something's got to give, but we can't let human freedom give. So we're going to uphold human freedom. So humans will do their actions, and that will result in either one, God not knowing exactly what you're going to do, so the future is closed off even to the divine, or God can't stop you from doing what you're doing. He can't intervene, because if he does, it's unjust, and you're not truly free if he intervenes. So you're not morally accountable and so on. So generically, and I'm talking in just generics here, of course, and you know, given the short time. So God's knowledge or his power is limited in one way, to uphold human freedom. So that's the below maneuver. So what I'm proposing then is saying, okay, these above and below maneuvers, why do we need to make, you know, these maneuvers? Let's just embrace the divine power and knowledge in its maximal, fullest sense, no modified sense. And let's embrace genuine human free will in its maximum sense, not in a modified sense, and embrace that as a contradiction, meaning that we embrace the conjunction of that we are genuinely free with that we accept the proposition that we are genuinely free in conjunction with the proposition that God is fully knowing and fully powerful, and accept that conjunction, however jarring that might be, however paradoxical it might sound. It doesn't matter if your logic allows it. If your logic allows for the contradiction to be upheld, then so be it. So we would then embrace it as a contradiction. Now, why would we embrace it as a contradiction? Well, a being like the divine and beings like us, small capital B and the capital B God, a being like God and being like us, the point at which the two intersect, i.e. the world, so the world being the conduit or the interface between the divine and the creature, that intersection, that occurrence is best explained via a contradiction. So God is fully omniscient and omnipotent, i.e. he knows everything and is all powerful, and we are fully free at the same time. How do we embrace that? We embrace it as a contradiction, i.e. we affirm both in the fullest sense, because that is the case when the divine comes into an interface with creatures. So when the world, which is the interface, the point, the contact point between the divine and the creature, when that occurs, we get a contradiction, i.e. that is the nature itself of that interaction is contradictory. So we embrace it as a contradiction, and that is not irrational, because according to a logical system we can embrace it, and it's not consistent. That's true. It wouldn't be consistent because you're allowing inconsistency now in your theology, but that's one way to solve a paradox like the omniscience paradox or the foreknowledge paradox. That are we free, or is God all-knowing and all-powerful, or which one gives? But the classical solutions, something had to give. We have to give up some aspect or constrain one aspect, and but on this view we're going to take both as it is. So that's the upshot of the paper. A contradictory theology then applied to this case study is to accept human freedom in its fullest sense and accept divine omniscience and omnipotence in its fullest sense, and embrace that as a contradiction because a different logical system allows you to embrace it, because contradictions will be valid on that logical system. So I'll finish it there, and if there's any comments or questions, it'd be great. I'll just stop sharing if that's necessary.
There are no true contradictions, are there really? For example, a married bachelor cannot exist. So I think the foreknowledge, you call it a foreknowledge paradox. It doesn't have to be, because maybe we just haven't worked out what the problem is yet, what the issue is. I mean, God may have foreknowledge of my absolute free choice of doing something in the future. Knowing doesn't force me to do anything, is one argument that we can say. So I don't see where there is a contradiction, really. And also changing the goalposts in order to allow in contradictions will lead, as you say, possibly to an appeal to mystery. But then which mysteries will we allow to appeal to us? 3 in 1, 1 in 3 is also a mystery according to the Christians. So what privileges their mystery over our mystery will then be the big question we have to ask in determining whether I choose Christianity or whether I choose Islam. So I think this is opening. It's very interesting, I think, as a thought experiment. But I don't think we can kid ourselves and say that there actually are real contradictions out there, such as a triangle that is a square at the same time as being a triangle. That is just illogical by any logic. And if we say, well, this is human logic, but God is God and God is Hakim, well, our system of logic is actually a reflection of divine hikmah. There is no demarcation between human logic and divine logic. There is only one logic. There is only one logical system, actually. We make the demarcation, I think, falsely. So I see lots of issues that will be thrown up by this, quite rightly. I mean, you have to be questioned on this. What's your initial response?
I think you've raised here, I think, a number of technical issues. So the first issue that you raised was whether it genuinely is, whether there are genuine contradictions. Now that will take us down the route of whether we embrace what we call metaphysical dialecticism. So is reality contradictory? So on this view, that on a contradictory theology, we would have to accept that there is at least one metaphysical contradiction, and that would be like the divine attributes will be a real contradiction. So, so there's contradictions on the level of metaphysics, a reality. Then we have semantic dialecticism. So the idea that contradiction rests at the level of language. So there's no contradiction actually in reality, but rather contradiction rests at the level of our language. The third one is what we call conceptual dialecticism. So conceptual dialecticism is the idea that contradictions don't reside in language, neither do they reside in reality, rather they reside in the constructs of our mind. So contradictions are just something that the mind constructs and configures rather than it being out there. So those are the three main ones. So yeah, this view would entail that at least there is one metaphysical contradictory reality, and that is God. Now the question is whether the conundrum itself, is a logical conundrum. The thing with the theologians, though, you see, so some of the solutions you gave, that God's knowledge doesn't coerce us, these are valid accounts. But if you look at the traditional solutions, some constraints were made, whichever theological school you look at. So the question is, do we want to constrain a divine attribute? Or do we want to constrain human freedom? The way it looked like in traditional theology, somewhere something had to give to a certain extent, or some modification had to be made. Now, on this view, the simplicity of it would be, you don't have to make any modifications. You don't have to curtail any sense of human freedom in a way that obviates human responsibility. So you embrace it in a full sense. And on the other hand, you don't even have to say, you don't have to accept the Jabariya position where, God compels us. You don't, or the Mu'tazili position that somehow the divine will be unjust if he sort of determines our actions and so on. Or even the sort of middle position of the acquisition theory, where in effect it collapses into determinism. So what this contradictory approach does is that enables you to be robustly embrace the two propositions in their full-blooded sense. And the full-blooded sense is a contradiction. Now, you rightly raise, what if this contradiction becomes promiscuous? What if this contradiction now spreads? This is where we now get into technical realms of logic, where does accepting a contradiction, or explosion we call in logic, we call that the principle of explosion, that if you smuggle logic into your system explodes and then anything goes. Now the Avicennan system, which is the logic adopted by most of the mutakallimun and philosophers, and that's an extension of the Farabian, Aristotelian, Stoic logic. For them, logic has to be both consistent and coherent. So it can never allow for either a contradiction, so you can't violate the law of contradiction, nor the law of excluding middle. You cannot, your logic has to be watertight, i.e. you can only accept a binary of true or false. Now, according...
Can I ask a question before time runs out?
Sorry, yes, so just very quickly, so remember, and I'll conclude. So the binary, so the system is that it's binary, either true or false. And that's the dominant story of logic until, about 100 years ago. Yeah. But there's more to be said on this. Yeah.
Okay, Mehmet.
Yeah, just admittedly, I do also have a problem with accepting contradiction. I've been pondering this question a lot. Just one suggestion, or maybe something for you to consider, like, would it be possible to see the future as possibilities, and then that's all known? It's a bit, it collapses into definite at the present time. It's a bit like the wave function in quantum physics. Yeah. The particle exists in many places, but when a conscious being looks at it, it collapses into a particle and a location. It kind of like qadar is could be like, or not. Maybe we just get lost in knowledge of Allah, whether He knows, like, what we don't know what Allah knows or what His knowledge entails. But I guess we can appreciate future as all sorts of possibilities, and when we make a choice, those possibilities collapse. So that seems to allow both infinite knowledge of Allah and a very important part of our choice as well.
Yeah, but even no, I take this. Yeah, definitely. I mean, what I'm not saying that some of the traditional responses to diffuse the paradox of foreknowledge and free actions aren't valid solutions, but they come at all of them have come at a modification of the divine attribute, a give or take. So why do that maneuver from above and below? You don't need to make those modifications on either side. You don't need to modify the sense of freedom. You don't need to modify the sense of any of the divine attributes. You accept them in the maximal sense, and you accept freedom in the maximal sense. But that entails, when they're brought into conjunction, that you have to accept it as a contradiction. So I'm just saying this is just, now the logical machinery I can't bring out now in this presentation, but that will take us in the realms of, subclassical logic that aren't classical. They don't follow the logical system developed by Frege, Russell, Whitehead, and Broad, and all these people. So your points are valid. They're possibilities, but they come at the cost of modifying. Can you see? They come at the cost of modifying.
Okay, before I read out some of the comments in the chat box, I just want to add that for me as well, not being into logic at all, but it seems to me that logic itself is limited to answer you try and solve this conundrum logically. So there we are. For me, it seems that logic is too limited to be able to solve this.
Yeah, this is a view that not any logical system can capture, but that will take you to the doctrine of divine ineffability. So that has certain assumptions that not even any language or logical system can capture God. But you see, the traditional scholars wouldn't accept that, because you can talk about God because God has talked about himself. Can you see? So there is something to describe God about. But what this logical system does, it just opens up the space of possibilities from just a binary of true and false.
Thank you. There's some comments probably similar to my comment here, but it says Ghazali makes a beautiful formulation. When the intellect contradicts the narration, the intellect is taken as the basis and the narration as is interpreted.
For sure, in the Qanun al-Ta'wil, he says that, but we'll have to see what application are we having here. What I would say, Ghazali's first posture would be in the Qanun al-Ta'wil is, you don't have to answer this question. You don't have to, because omniscience in knowledge is not anything that we can attain. We'd have to know everything. So yeah, that's a route to take. I'm just exploring that if we want to avoid these kind of logical contradictions, that here's a solution that embraces it. And where does it take us? Yeah, some of the things that Colin mentioned open up, and that has to be worked out for sure. For sure.
More comments here. Like Dr. Turner, I do not see the fact that God knows our choices, how this is going to limit our freedom in choosing.
Sorry, if God doesn't know what you're going to do.
Like Dr. Turner, I do not see the fact that God knows our choices, how this is going to limit our freedom in choosing.
Oh, right. So because of the argument that I set out in the PowerPoint presentation isn't the full-blooded argument, so the question is, can you make God's knowledge false? That's the point, through your free choice. If you do, then there's an issue here, because the divine cannot have false, you can't suddenly, you make his knowledge false, can you see, by your actions. So you can't have that entailment, and none of the scholars wanting to embrace that. And in the paper, I mentioned a quote from Razi and others that if you're going to go down that route, where the creature can impact the divine's knowledge and make it false, then you're landing in a bit of dangerous territory. So the logical argument they saw was that you didn't want creaturely power. Creature couldn't have power over the divine in any way.
Another comment, why is freedom the base for discussion? Why choose that as the basis?
Oh, because that was the way it's been construed theologically. So the Muslims inherited the discussion from antiquity, and that's how they framed it, that in order for you to have meaningful choice, in order for you to have accountability, your choices must be morally significant. And your choices can only be morally significant if you could choose otherwise, what they call istita'a, you have the ability to do the contrary. So if you don't have the ability to do the contrary, then you don't have meaningful free choice, and then God can't make you accountable and so on. So that was the context, yeah.
You might have to repeat yourself. Yeah, I think it says human freedom is not like God's freedom. God has given man a certain area of freedom out of his grace in order to impose responsibility.
For sure, for sure. But that's what every scholar acknowledged. But here the issue isn't the dimension of the kind of freedom we have. That's not what's issue. The issue is, does the type of freedom that we've been given, however limited, if meaningful freedom, can that be consistent with divine foreknowledge? That's the conundrum for them. Of course, our freedom is limited, yeah.
Mr. Dr. Blolansari is got a comment. Does this open a door to critical theorists who argue for the contradiction of sex assigned at birth, the contradiction of binary of male and female? Can this down the road open the road to live in contradiction as an exercise of free will?
Only if you accept a contradiction blows up your logical system. If you accept that one contradiction blows up your entire logical system, like what Ibn Sina believed, that if you smuggle in just one contradiction, you've now lapsed into trivialism. Everything becomes true. But on this view, on this logical system, not everything is true, and not every contradiction is accepted. Only what is motivated by the theology. If your theology has a motivation to embrace the contradiction, then your logic won't prevent it. That's all.
Okay, I think I must have missed it. There's another comment. The basis should be linked to hereafter. It's about accountability. That's the main concern of humans.
Yeah, so that's the issue, isn't it? So if your freedom is not morally significant, but then God punishes you for your actions, some theological groups looked at that and thought, well, my freedom will be meaningless then, my free choice, if I am punished for actions that I didn't freely do.
Our next chairman is Brother Safaruk Chaudhuri. Are you ready?
Brilliant. All right, welcome back, everyone. We've got a fantastic lineup for this session for sure. Let me just read out the order that it's going to go in, and inshallah I'll pass it over. So first we're going to have Dr. Saifuddin Kara on his presentation, The Role of Supplication in Divine Communication, followed by Dr. Ismail Hassan Biojlu, who's going to present on epistemic justification for the Burhan and Natiq as an establishing proof for argumentation. And then we're going to have this session concluded by Dr. Fariya Salim, and her wonderful presentation is going to be on prophetology and Islamic spiritual care. So I'm not going to waste any time. I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Saifuddin. Tafadhal mashkoora.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.
Yeah.
I'd like to first of all thank Colin, Mashid, and Tuba for the opportunity, and of course for the International Foundation for Muslim Theology. It's been I've been enjoying this rich conversation, and I'd like to also contribute to this conversation by talking on the role of supplication in divine communication. I would like to first talk about the story of the chapter and then read a section of it that is the short section of it, so that I respect the time limit. My intention was, of course, there are works on supplication on especially Colin's article, which is actually my starting point, and but it hasn't received, I think, enough attention especially in our life. It's we have this formal communication with God, which is the Quran text, that there is, of course, the angels bring it to the prophet, and then the prophet teaches and preaches it. But this is within this communication, there is also a special kind of communication which takes place without any intermediaries, without anybody. It's a very intimate connection between God and his creatures, and this is what the Quran actually teaches. And this was my interest, that how Quran, okay, we read the books, and there are like in theological books that there are the description of supplication, but I wanted to find out how is this supplication described and explained in the Quran. Because in the Quran we have these beautiful supplications that God teaches to his creatures, and he's kind of very keen, anxious to teach. This is because it's a very, very rewarding process, and it's a way of making things right and making it easy on us, because the life can be very difficult. There are spiritual problems that we come across, and there are, of course, material problems that we come across, difficulties that we are facing day to day, and supplication is a way of overcoming those difficulties. And if we believe in the connection between the spiritual realm and the material realm, and the connection between the two, and the power of human soul, I think there is a very important ground for this supplication, the importance of supplication. But what we understand from the existing literature is it's not been emphasized enough. And also there are like artificial boundaries created between this supplication, this very important tool, and the individuals, like normal people. For example, looking from the philosophical perspective, we have this, certain levels that one needs to reach to supplicate, and those supplications to be granted. And on the other hand, some very extreme Sufi interpretations that we have. For example, Abdullah ibn Mubarak, who lived in the 2nd century, he famously said, "It is about 50 years that I have not supplicated nor wished anyone should pray for me, because supplication is considered is lack of submission to God's will. Because in supplication you try to change the course of events and make the problem go away, whether it's spiritual problem or material problem." So I think in that sense, I wanted to revisit this supplication and try to make it more simpler for believers, normal believers, not just like an academic research. This is, I think, it's not a purely academic. It's more making it available, the supplication, bringing its supplication back to people. So I like to now read briefly. I have, I think, 15 minutes left. According to Islamic teachings, aside from the formal method of divine communication, every creature of God has an informal form of free access to God without the medium of prophets. This secondary form of divine communication is supplication. According to Muslim theology, supplication is a free form of connection to God. It is fundamentally different from other Islamic rituals and worships, which are strictly regulated, commanded, and conditioned. There may be certain presettings for a successful supplication, such as a sincere and humble heart, state of being in absolute dependence on God, which could enhance the effect of supplication. Further, it is believed that supplication is a universal phenomenon. So long as individuals believe in a creator, there is no requirement of being a Muslim to make a petition to God, as it is an open invitation for everyone. Quote, "Invoke me and I'll respond to you." Quran and 60, Surah 40 and verse 60. What would my Lord care for you if not for your supplication? Quran 25:77. Is he not best who responds to the desperate, one when he calls upon him and removes evil? Quran 27:62. A more striking example of this to this effect is, and when they board a ship, they supplicate Allah, sincere to him in religion, but when he delivers them to the land, at once they associate others with him. Quran 29:65. The verse implies that let alone the supplication of faint-hearted believers, even the sincere supplication of polytheists could be accepted, because it is a simple and intimate process of communication between the creator and created without any formalities. Moreover, the Quranic verse indicates that God takes this intimate connection seriously and promises to respond to the legitimate supplications, of course, within the boundaries of divine wisdom. The boundaries seems to have been established in the following verse. And remember that Abraham was tried by his Lord with specific commands, which he fulfilled. He said, I will make thee an imam to the nations. He pleaded, and also imams from my offsprings. God answered, but my promise is not within reach of evildoers. The verse is one of the most striking examples that teach believers the power and efficacy of intimate communication with God in Muslim scriptures. Yet, it also shows the limits of supplication by giving an example of when and how a supplication may be declined, even if it comes from one of his most trusted agents. God may grant spiritual and material qualities to individuals for their spiritual achievement, or simply because of their willingness to ask God, thus acknowledging his power, generosity, and the feebleness of human existence. Yet, God does not upset the delicate balance built upon the preservation of free will, so long as individuals make a conscious decision to follow the path of ungodliness. It is contrary to God's wisdom to turn their heart to faith, let alone make them leaders or role models for the preservation of faith. Therefore, while God elevates the status of Abraham to the highest level of human existence, he kindly declines his request to extend his position to the leadership, to his offspring, at least not all of them. In this way, this particular verse establishes the boundaries of the influence of supplication over the material and spiritual realm of human existence. As I will not note below, Quran portrays God as extremely generous in granting supplicants' petition that may easily change the course of the system of causality or other physical rules that dominate human life in this world. Despite its informal nature, reading through the Quran, one can quickly notice that God provides templates for successful supplication in his formal communications due to its great power over physical and spiritual realms. The relevant verses of the Quran demonstrate God's eagerness to educate people for petitioning the reasonable requests, both related to physical and spiritual realms. This is most often done through quoting supplications of prophets in the Quran. These supplications are mentioned in the Quran to teach people what and how to ask from the Creator. Most significantly, but less often, God directly interferes in the process of supplication and teaches his creation how and what to ask from him directly. So this was the introduction part of the chapter, and now I'm going to read from the section, the supplication in the Quran. In addition to the verses mentioned above, there are many verses encourages people to invoke God for their deeds. And when my servants ask you, O Muhammad, about me, indeed I am near. I respond to the invocation of supplicant when he calls upon me. Quran 2, 186. Invoke your Lord humbly and in private. Quran 7:55. Invoke him in fear and hope. Quran 7:56. These are the promising verses from God to believers. God asks people to invoke him when people are in need. He then reassures people that he is near and will respond to the invocations, especially the one which comes from humble, fearful, distressed, and hopeful heart.
5 minutes, David, sorry to interrupt. 5 minutes.
Yeah, sure. Further, supplications which are made in private seem to be more effective, as they are likely to be more intimate and sincere. It appears that the recipe for successful supplication is simple. First, faith in a mighty God is a precondition, as the invokers should acknowledge from the bottom of their heart that there is an almighty creator out there who listens to his people and can bestow favors upon them when they call upon him. It only takes to achieve the state of humble, fearful, desperate, and hopeful heart, which are the key ingredients to connect to God and activate his individual mercy and blessing. The emphasis of Quran 286 on the proximity of God is noteworthy. I'm just skipping through. Perhaps one of the most compelling evidence for the success of invocation combined with strong emotion is mentioned in chapter Al-Ankabut. And when they board a ship, they supplicate Allah, sincere to him in religion, but when he delivers them to the land, at once they associate others with him. Aside from providing a compelling example of human ungratefulness towards divine blessings, what makes this verse more remarkable is that it explicitly refers to the polytheists who, in the moment of distress, turn to God alone and invoke him for their safety. God then responds to this invocation by delivering them to land safely, yet they then go back to their state of polytheism. An all-knowing God should have been aware of their transient embracing of the faith. Nevertheless, God does not rebuff their request. According to the verse, a momentary focused emotion of desperation overcomes the disbelief in a soul, and in this sincerity of heart immediately triggers God's response to invocation. It is almost a mechanical process operating in the spiritual realm. In this sense, God, in accepting supplications, does not discriminate based on religious conviction or the level of faith accumulated in the heart. His main criterion is the sincerity of heart, whether it is transient or long-lasting. Once this condition is fulfilled, God seems to respond supplications habitually. The Quran encourages people to supplication through mentioning the invocation of previous prophets who needed support, protection, reassurance, and victory in their struggle against their enemies. The outcome of these supplications was mentioned in the Quran to increase believers' conviction that their supplication would be answered. For example, when Adam acknowledges his error in his sincere and remorseful supplication, God responds to him positively and forgives him and his wife. And there are some other examples of prophets, but I just want to finish the talk with the last example. And this example is, I think, very important. However, one of the most striking invocations mentioned in the Quran is mentioned not from a prophet, but from the mother of Mary, who implores God for her daughter's protection. Mention, O Muhammad, when the wife of Imran said, "My Lord, indeed I have pledged to you what is in my womb, consecrated for your service. So accept this from me. Indeed, you are the hearing and the knowing." But when she delivered her, she said, "My Lord, I have delivered a female," and Allah was most knowing of what she delivered. "And the male is not like the female, and I have named her Mary, and I seek refuge for her in you and for her descendants from Satan, expelled from the mercy of Allah." So her Lord accepted her with good acceptance and caused her to grow in a good manner and put her in the care of Zechariah. Every time Zechariah entered upon her in the prayer chamber, he found with her provision. He said, "O Mary, from where is this coming to you?" She said, "It is from Allah. Indeed, Allah provides for whom He wills without account." One of the strongest human emotions is the love of mother for her child. So she utilizes this strong emotion for a very righteous cause. What makes these verses noteworthy is that God responds to the wife of Imran's supplication and accepts little Mary as a gift of her dedication to God. He then protects her from the internal and external influences of Satan and makes her raise in the best manner under the supervision of Prophet Zechariah. It seems the supplication of her mother did not only help her to be raised in the best manner away from the many dangers of life, but also provided her with worldly provisions on a daily basis. Because the verse states, every time Zechariah entered upon her in the prayer chamber, he found with her provisions. It is not clear if the provisions appeared as a result of her mother's supplication or Mary also made supplications for provisions, but it is certain that the daily provision was a result of supplication. Despite their highly elevated status, neither Mary nor her mother were prophets. And yet they could communicate with God through invocation, and God would listen to their invocations. The Quran also includes God's response to the invocations of the other significant figures, such as magicians of Pharaoh and the seven sleepers, hence provide the believers with the wisdom of great many benefits of sincere and hopeful supplication. Okay, that's it. I think this is what I was trying to do in my chapter, that supplication is not just exclusive to certain individuals, or it comes with, great many purifications, but it's completely related to the nearness of God and strong human emotions and pure human emotions. I think, thank you very much.
Brilliant, thank you. Right, so now we've got about just over 10 minutes for our Q&A. I'm going to go in order that I see the hands according to the participants list. So I do apologize if I pick you and you know. But yeah, so Mashid, I've got your hand up. Is that
okay? Thank you very much for a really interesting talk, Saifuddin. I just want to ask, if supplication is totally without intermediary, does this not contradict God's transcendence?
In what sense?
Unmute. Can you hear me now?
Okay.
Okay,
Yes,
because God is transcendent and we're contingent, so we can't really directly.
Well,
yeah. So how can this happen? Without totally and complete intermediary. So how does God communicate? He said there was no intermediary with God to supplicate. Isn't there some kind of intermediary? Sorry.
Well, this idea of transcendence, I think that my reading is that philosophers are making it a little bit difficult. Like we make it ourselves difficult, this connection, because this is what I understand from the verses of the Quran, that God says, I'm near to you. I'm near, and ask from me. So instead of going and coming up with these very complex theological arguments and making it like this connection more complicated, it doesn't help anyone. And my argument is that this is how it is. It's very simple. As long as we believe that there is a creator, even, the example I gave in the Quran is that this polytheists, and in a moment of desperation, they realize that they are so feeble. And this is what we feel in our lives, that there are moments in our lives we are very feeble, and we know that there is something out there. We don't know, we don't reach this conclusion from this reading this complex theological works and theological arguments. We just know it in our heart because we are inbuilt with this faith, I think, and then we are here to understand and expand our knowledge of God. So we don't need in that kind of, and in the moment of desperation, this intense feeling, we come to this realization that there is a God, and we ask for help, and he grants it. It's just automatically. And the only condition here is not this transcendence, all this theological, having that knowledge of those or understanding of those complex theological concepts. Is just to understand the God, like there is one God and creator, and he's there to help us. And this operates, I think, it's not a random process as well. That's what I'm trying to argue, that it is almost a mechanical process, because this is a system that operates. I mean, in this world, we have this material world, but there's also a spiritual realm, and they have it. This spiritual realm it has its own rules, and I think in the Quran, that's what God teaches to people, that these rules, that how to unlock, how to make use of these rules, because so long as we have a good intention, we have, we fulfill these conditions, we can communicate with God, and he responds to, and he answers to those requests, legitimate ones. Of course, I mentioned also the issue of freedom, that he wouldn't force upon, like Ibrahim, Prophet Ibrahim asks to make his descendants also imams, but there is, of course, individual choices are also important. And within that framework, I think he justifies, he grants these applications. I don't know if I answered your question, but my point is that simple terms, I think we shouldn't make too much theology. We shouldn't focus too much on theology. Some things are, I think, simpler than that and easily understandable. You don't need even words. It's just simple human emotions, and would resolve some of the problems.
Yeah, I mean, I get your point that we are innately connected to our creator.
Yes.
But what I'm trying to say is we can't be physically connected, because as dependent creatures. So there's always been some kind of intermediary to, because there's two aspects of Allah. Allah is closer to us than our jugular vein. On the other hand, Allah is transcendent. We can never know his essence. So, we need to kind of be in the middle. I think where you are, probably innately we're close to Allah, but we can never know the essence of Allah. So we could somehow, it's not contradictory. It's going to, it's almost going to Sam's point.
Okay, now I understand your question better. But here we are, we are not trying to understand God. We are just asking something. We are in distress. But that connection actually, it's actually connecting as well individuals to God. And, sometimes we don't need to know everything about God, because then he's not God. If you know anything, if you know God truly, then he's not God, because then, as you said, it's just defeats the whole theology, that because he's not infinite anymore, that within your grasp of your mind. So of course, there is not that kind of understanding. And I think even the prophets and the greatest prophets have that kind of power to understand God, fully comprehend God, which means that you are making him, setting boundaries for God. But what I'm trying to say here is that this connection. In order to have that connection, I don't think we need to understand God fully, or we just, it's also a form of communication.
Sorry,
Yes.
can I quickly move in, Colin here? I think Colin had his hand up.
Yes, I've been, yeah,
I've seen
with
your question, and then we can get things.
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Saif. It's very interesting. I'm just wondering whether you came across the idea, as I did when I was researching Dua, that Dua is as much about calling on Allah without actually asking for anything, calling on Allah as an affirmation of his divine names and attributes, because that's what we do when we make Dua. We direct it to a name or an attribute or a series of names and attributes. And in a sense, it's a way of affirming the creator-created relationship, rather than just being, a petition. There's petitionary prayer, intercessionary prayer, prayers asking for things in particular. But Dua, I think in its purest form, and I wondered whether you'd come across this, is basically a kind of reaffirmation of the names and attributes as we perceive them. And it's a kind of entreaty that we may be given more understanding. As you said, we can't know God completely, but calling on God's wisdom, for example, we can ask him to manifest his wisdom in ways that are fathomable to us and make sense to us. So it's a kind of affirmation, really, of the attributes and the names, as much as being an entreaty for something, a petition for something, and that may not even enter the equation.
I read a very interesting paper, Colin. I'm now started a course. I'm doing a course here on early Gospels, and with because there's a very good expert here at University of Toronto, John Kloppenberg. He's very, very big guy. And last week we had it's somehow related to your point. We had a very interesting reading. It's called Magic or Miracle, some 2nd century instances. And after reading this article, he kept asking us, what is the difference between miracle and magic? Because, in the for people who lived in the 2nd century Middle East, because magic, that they had the magic, that it was a very superstitious world, and there were magicians, healers, and they manipulated the words, asking God for favors, like, they had their own, whatever you say, their lives, and they are manipulating, gods for their understanding, so that they can get individual benefits from those for the polytheists who lived in the 2nd century Middle East or Anatolia. And then Jesus came, and he said he's using again these words, like it's a form of supplication. He performed the miracles, but of course miracles were coming from God, and he was getting individual benefits from that, not for himself but for individuals, and for others who are sick, and he healed people, raised the dead. So, and then there's of course lots of discussion, and then it goes on. But this was a question that stuck to me, that what is the difference? Because in prayer, if we just reduce it to asking favors from God, yeah, it is kind of same thing, isn't it? We are using some knowledge, a form of knowledge, to manipulate, or not to manipulate. Manipulate is a vicious word, but asking God for favors. And it's so I think we need to think about here more. And I think your point is important, because there is this acknowledgement of God, that that this getting connected to God. And
I can just quickly do we have time for another question?
So we have some questions in the chat
if I just can conclude this point here, I think
Very
I think
interesting
that
stuff. Just go for it.
Yeah. I was going to say, yeah. That's right.
yeah.
Please.
So just important is, I think, you know, what you said is also very important. It should be taken into consideration. But there is also like, okay, this is at higher level, you know, we can engage in this kind of theological discussions and then acknowledge it. But what I was trying to also, I thought this chapter is also in the sense that we are talking about getting to the roots, like individuals in a you know, uneducated or, you know, lay people wouldn't know about these kind of theological concepts and you know, all these attachment. So I think this is what the Quran's language is as well, that Quran doesn't talk to the philosophers or theologians. He's talking to people, like people who can just get something out of it, who can, you know, learn from it. So in that sense, I think I limited myself to people, the normal people level, and because there are some writings on higher levels, Sufis, philosophers. So in that sense, I limited myself to that, just Quran's level. That the level, of course, not the level that he speaks. Quran speaks to people, lay people.
I think that's very helpful. It fits in very well with the whole pastoral wing of our project.
Yes, that's one.
So thank you for doing that.
Brilliant.
We are a few minutes ahead of ourselves, so it's okay to, if it's okay with you, Saf, I'll read some of the comments.
Yes, I was going to say, let's do that before I bring
okay, because we were 5 minutes ahead of ourselves. Brilliant. So what I'll do, I'll read the comments, and among them are maybe some questions. So then feel free to answer you know, anything that you want to ask, so because you might not have time to go over all of them. So Dr. Kara, your presentation is very helpful for clinical pastoral educators that pedagogically includes supplication as a closing pastoral counseling. Your categorization of supplications in the Quran has a very practical utility to caregivers in training. Thank you. So it's just a comment. In Tafrika, Ghazali frames this as this is granted as both a gift and a gratuity. And we have another comment here. Allah Ta'ala is near, close, and intimate, and there is no veil between us and him. Tears are the gateway to God's mercy, always, as Torah says, there's no door which can't be opened by tears. And another comment, magic is unreal. Miracles are real, but miracles happen because Allah can change order of cause and effect. Prayers are a kind of divine miracle. And what do you say about the prophetic case of Prophet Ayub? What do you say about his practice of what appears to be a preference to gratitude of blessing in the midst of suffering? Where is patience and supplication? So that's a question. You may want to answer that.
I think that's a comment.
Okay. Is there a question mark at the end of it?
Yeah, okay. It is, but I think he's also, you know, he's answering, kind of self-answering to it.
Okay. Miracles are based on supernatural connection and not natural ones, in my view. Okay. It seems to me that this understanding of supplication does look to theology in the very practical sense. It looks to the immediacy of human emotion and experience and how that opens up connection with the Creator. It rests upon a needs-based theology, whereupon supplication, sorry, I'll just scroll down. Supplication becomes the medium through which the reality of one's needs are acknowledged and expressed. Thank you, Dr. Kara, for these insights. So they're all comments.
It's my pleasure. I mean, I learned also, it's different perspectives as well. Thank you very much.
I think I've got
I think there are two questions. If if we have time.
I think it was Farah and then Yasmin, was it?
Thank you. Thank you so much for the presentation. I think this is going to be very in line with Aisha Noor's comment, in the sense that, and sort of synthesizes Dr. Colin and Dr. Mashid's comment, in the sense that the intercessor between the transcendence, the transcendence of God and sort of the reality of the human being is the needs with which man is created. And so those are also an innate connection, in the sense that their needs are created within us, and those become the means by which one can communicate with the creator of those needs. And the other point that sort of came in mind was perhaps like your emphasis on the feebleness of the polytheists, and later in this chapter, Maryam, about her shaking the palm tree, speaks to the notion of acknowledging one's needs. And it is through that acknowledgement that becomes the intercessing power for acceptance of supplication. So in one way, Dr. Colin's comment of like prayer being an affirmation is true in the sense that prayer is essentially affirmation of one's needs and one's createdness, or I really found it sort of a synthesis in some of these comments, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Farah. This is also very insightful, your comment.
Yasmin? And then I think we'll probably move to wrap up.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your really interesting presentation, Saifuddin. I just wanted to add something. I'm not a theologian, so I've got a more anthropological background, and I wanted to ask a question concerning the word magic that you just mentioned, that you went to these classes and the person was asking you about what's the difference between magic and miracle, and and from an anthropological perspective, it's a very problematic word, because especially in the anthropology of religion, because back in the 19th century when Christianity was still very, very strong, miracle was referred to those acts which were considered true religion, so they were considered Christianity. So like, I don't know, Jesus curing the leper and all of that sort of thing. And magic was referred to those things which were not true religion, so they weren't Christianity. So when they went out into deepest, darkest Africa and studied all those different religions, and that was magic, because behind it was a falsehood. So I was wondering, how do you understand that? Do you see that difference? How does that and how do you think it translates into Islamic ideas of miracle?
I think from the religious perspective, it's very easy to explain. Okay, magic is just it's vicious in its essence. It's just based on manipulation of gods, and which makes it actually gods are not able to understand human intentions. On the other hand, from the religious perspective, it's actually there's a spiritual world, and in that spiritual world there is a system, and prayer, supplication, or any other relevant concepts are just way of operating within that spiritual realm. And this is a knowledge, a type of knowledge. It's like the knowledge of it's a science or medicine in the sense that the God is can grant this kind of knowledge to people. So it's not the same thing. But in that sense, we were talking about how Matthew, actually we were talking about the Gospels, that how Matthew edited his Gospel because he wanted to dissociate Christianity from this miracle stories. He heavily edited these miracle stories because it looked like magic, and he wanted to dissociate Christianity with paganism. So because it didn't seem any difference to normal people. So it was actually a way of early Christian theologians or scholars to find themselves new identity. So, but of course, as you said, later on, it became an anthropology. In the later centuries, it turned into an anthropological issues. So, but from the Islamic point of view, I think once we accept that there is a spiritual realm, and this spiritual realm, it has its own way of working, and this spiritual knowledge supplication is the just knowledge of how this world operates, is an acknowledgement of how this world is operate. I think it makes a lot of sense, and the difference becomes clear. It's not that you are trying to manipulate gods, but just God is one God, one mighty God is teaching you, giving you knowledge and wisdom to how to operate within a spiritual realm.
Now on to our second presentation in this fantastic lineup. And I want to pass over to Sidi Ismail to start to sort of introduce, of course, himself, and then very briefly, and then the presentation.
Okay, Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much, Saf. Actually, with all dear colleagues, it's wonderful to be together after 6-7 months later. As all you remember, we were together in our first workshop. I'm so glad to be among all authors and participants here. Alhamdulillah, it's been quite interesting time to bring our minds around the God talk, divine talk in our IFMT project. It is great. In this project, actually, there is something I always try to put my mind around, is that actually how the talks of God or God talks are, shaping our minds and lives. So in my chapter, I try to look at the issues about prophethood and prophets, and the prophet as a last prophet, Muhammad ﷺ, as their message, as their indications in our life as a word. So following up to our project, I always trying to bring all my sentences to bring around this main concept, God talk, and God talk is in his revelation and in his actually in his creation and in his prophets, as such in specific prophets, which we may not know all of them, but we may not make any differences amongst the prophets. La nufarriku bayna ahadin min rusuli. There is no differences amongst the prophets. So when we have our, the mind around these talks, first of all, actually, I will, most welcome your guidance and contributions on this specific epistemic grounding of the issue. Saf is also most welcome. I am Ismail Latif Hacı Nebioğlu. As trained theologian and following up philosophical issues, I'm teaching philosophy and religious studies as chair of logic in Istanbul University at the moment. My whole teachings last 20-25 years is going all around about philosophy of language, philosophy of religion, and specifically history of logic, and more specifically about the history of logic in Muslim heritage. So in this sense, as I try to follow up the prophets, if I started to talk about the prophets, I mean the first man as a prophet, Adem alayhi salam, is the one, as far as we know, the first man and the first man who has the language and has a communication to another person. leaving aside all different discussions and argumentations, I want to emphasize, specifically about, the language tools of the prophets and the prophets' talk. Mainly my epistemic grounds will indicate that actually how one as a human being can ground prophetic talk in our daily experience, daily expressions, and daily understandings. So in this sense, the whole chains of the prophets actually are specific talk in their essence on behalf of the God, and sometimes they carry the word of God. So they have kind of many ways and faces of their talk. Sometimes they talk like Abraham, Moses, and the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ as well. When they talk as they are carrier of the word of God. So human beings, all peoples around them, hear the words of God through their tongues. So I haven't heard myself the word of God myself. I may hear some of the ilhamat, some of the kind of inclinations of the God towards each individual creatures and each individual human beings, but as a whole message of God came through in the tongue of that certain prophet. So that certain prophet spoke of the word of God to others, to other human beings who hear them, or they want to hear them, or they kind of neglect to hear those prophets. In this sense, when I say epistemic grounding, I am trying to emphasize to take this word as a ground of the source of the knowledge. The source of the knowledge will be kind of follow up in that prophetic talk. The prophets have this position to be source of knowledge, so they deliver their message in different faces, like Bilal has mentioned, as a shepherd, as a messenger, as a the guider, or as a the ruler, and so on and so forth. I try to kind of mention all these different faces, but in every cases, his words and action came together, and their actions also followed in their words, and their words are followed up in their actions. So this is actually interesting point for us to understand how the word of prophets, or prophet's word, can be related to divine word, as they are claiming. Like Muhammad ﷺ has lived in Mecca many years, but one day he came up in the mouth of the Mecca, and he said, oh dear people, if I say you something, would you believe? Some people are coming behind this mountain. They say, of course we will believe in you. So then he expressed his message. He is the messenger of God, and he carried the word of God. So he had his own proofs of being prophet in his words, he claimed. So what is the differences, this so-called self-claimed proposition and then false claims? So we always talk about these features of the prophets, like their words are correct, and their words are always in contact with the reality, and they are always trustworthy people. They are always so and so forth. I don't want to get into this in 15 minutes, but they are the features of the prophet. But what is the main point one might distinguish epistemically? Like Musaylamatul Kazzab, the much liar one in the South Yemen, he claimed, I am the prophet as well. But how one can distinguish these two distinct character, as a Mukhbir-i Sadiq, who is the most trustworthy person, and he gives to his message, his guidance, his words and actions, and guiding people. I have the other attributes there. This person is different than the other liar one. So one should have this logical analysis, how to distinguish two sides. So in this sense, I have many actually points in there, in this point. Traditionally, this is called Delail-i Nübüvve, the proofs of the prophethood. But I don't want to just emphasize on this one, although I have some critiques. I am too much broadening the sense. Actually, there's a reason for me on this point, because the prophet and the prophets, either as a single last prophet, the Muhammad, or the whole silsile, all chains of the prophet, or each of them, like Abraham or Moses, all these carrying the same position. So they kind of support each other's epistemic position. If, like, Abraham alayhi salam is rightful, if he is right in his message, if he is correct in his message, if he is this, if he is that, he is supporting the Moses alayhi salam, and Moses alayhi salam is supporting the Jesus, and Jesus alayhi salam is supporting the whole chains of the prophethood since the beginning of humanity. So they kind of back up each other. So what are the points on their backup position in their logical analysis? I find them their languages, I find them their characteristics. Like, someone may say the truth, but may not be ontologically together with this ontological status in their own selves. So this is one of the criteria. They say things and they also apply and applicate those things in their actions. In this sense, we can start, for example, another point in their own features, like their language tools. Language tools of the prophet, they indicate and they frame the reality talks. So regarding our project, the prophetic talk is all around the realistic talks. In this sense, one of the main emphasis in my chapter, I am trying to, in all my sections, I am trying to emphasize that actually the prophets and each prophet and the last prophet, actually, they are proposing us in their all variation, in their all various activities and whatever they have. Actually, this position should be in the same line, and their language, their personal features, and their how can I say, actually, their proofs for their prophethood are actually in the same line. So, for example, if we are talking about miracles in one section, I don't want to get into much detail, because the talk about the miracles like in nature and necessity is something else. But whatever we experience in the last prophet, his relation into nature is exactly the same feature in the other prophethoods, in the other prophets' life, in the chain of the prophethood. So in this sense, another example could go, I don't want to get into detail as well in this one. If one knows about anything, the question goes like this: how one know about anything about the reality? Okay, I can logically understand the reality, but I need someone who tells me in experience. This is the main line I'm trying to follow up throughout the chapter. The experience, tecrübe. So tecrübe is the prophet is giving the message of the God, but also he is the most living experience. This is the epistemic side of it. Living experience. So everyone can see him. Everyone may criticize him. Everyone may look into records of his being living experience. So living experience, I think, is very important as a word of God, word of prophet, and also we should actually add this word of the nature. They are saying exactly the same message, but I can experience with that person. One may say, actually, he lived 1400 years ago. Well, he still experience. It is traditional, as you may remember, Kıyas-ı Temsili. In logical epistemic grounding, one of the most inductive way is called Kıyas-ı Temsili. You see living experience. You see miracles in his hand. You see way of action. You know, you see how to have the attitude for or against so on and so forth things. You have the experience in the prophetic tradition. So actually it is called prophetic wisdom, prophetic way of life, prophetic way of speaking, not only speaking, but when I say speech, or when I say prophetic word in this chapter, I always remember in my mind, I mean the practice of the prophet in that assertion, in that proposition. So in this sense, I try to emphasize as well the consistency without involving sub-chapter, consistency in his frame, consistency, his being, Kıyas-ı Temsili, in most exemplary induction. So exemplary induction will remind me, how can I use his words as theoretical base? I think this might be worth remembering that in the Usuli tradition, Usulis do not take the word of Quran as a revelation. They don't say this verse is the ground of my source of knowledge. Of course, it is source for knowledge. But what they do, they utilize these statements of the Quran and they produce epistemic justification out of these words. So
5 minutes, sorry.
Okay, if someone is kind of bring out any justification over these words, it is open to discussion. We may discuss about this, and you may produce schools, you may produce various of the discussions over this argumentation. Of course, the word of Quran is revelation as it is revealed and as it is kept as it is. And hadith, the words and the actions of the Rasulullah was kept in, Kütüb-i Sitte, Kütüb-i Khamse, and in all various books and in recordings. What I mean here, without involving on those technical discussions, I am offering that actually for wider audiences. We need to connect ourselves to the prophet, his living experience, as he's living now with me. And I am trying to understand and justify my thinkings over his understanding, and purify, if you like. I'm not getting into supplication, purifying our hearts by publication. Already my dear colleague has done this. I am emphasizing that actually the purifying our justifications through understanding of his truth and the false preferences, because justification should go always how one produce the argumentations. So when I produce argumentation, I am so-called Muslim, but all my thinkings may not be Islamic, or may not be according to Quran and Hadith. So in this sense, when I look at the prophet, I need to purify my justification of argumentation. We have kind of the proof for the existence of God. They prove in the history also, they have been discussed. I'm not getting into that as well. I have done this in my PhD, but I am not much involving the points about the value of justification of the argumentation. I am trying to much emphasize that, for example, in the understanding of the prophetic frame, to produce my own argumentation over the, my aesthetical understanding, my shaping of my logos, my shaping of my, the pathos in the way of my ground of thinking. So I think when we talk about the ground of thinking, we have to go back to the tools of the language. What are the tools of the language? The prophet was the man who he speaks of the Arabic in best way. He has the best manner of using the Arabic this way. So these are important. But what I'm trying to emphasize, of course, there are need for writing about each of them, but I am trying to bring the whole idea that those talks, to those prophetic words should be relevant to mind of people, and we need to bring intact of our justifications according to that. Truthfulness, coherency, consistency are amongst them. But of course, these are also very technical usages. But what the word of prophet is teaching us, I think, the practicality. I mentioned this as well, practicality, but mostly simplicity of our understanding. In regard of our project as well, this simplicity is very important. It is related to each of us, each member of the humanity, everywhere, for everybody, in every shape. But all we need to emphasize that actually the prophets witnessing about justification of truth and reality is important. Last point that I want to emphasize, that in our time, maybe much longer time, but certainly in our times, we neglect to talk about prophethood. The prophethood in Islam is completely and distinctly different than any other religion. There are resemblances of Christianity and Judaism, and we talk about the prophetic Nostradamus, stories, but this is not story, this is the reality. And in order to emphasize the prophetic nubuwweh, the position, and bring that in our minds is very important, and it will help to shape our minds and our understanding. I hope your contribution will help me as well to shape my chapter. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ote. Thanks for that. So now we've got about 15 minutes.
Did I finish early?
No, I think you bang on. You're spot on. So yeah, it's open to questions and comments. There's a couple. I'm gonna have to, or I think Mashi can probably read it. Colin, do you have your hand up? Let me just see.
Yeah, I did. Thank you. Ismail, thank you. That was amazing. You didn't pause at all. It was beautifully flowing and it was wonderful. Thank you. And very, very clear. Basically, what I got from that, and you know, on a very simple level, for me, I mean, I'm simplifying it in my own mind, is that the Prophet, As-salatu was-salam, is his own proof, in other words. So the proof of Nabuwwah is the Prophet himself. This is what I'm getting from your talk, your presentation, that the Prophet is a kind of self-contained man who includes all of the proofs and indications and allusions of his own truth, of his own prophethood. From his acta and dicta, you know, from the things that he did, from the things that he said, from his behavior, from his fitra, from his interaction with other people, from all of these things, they all constitute experiential proofs. Am I understanding that correctly?
To be honest, thank you very much for these comments, Colin. Actually, I am very much appreciating that. I hope to do these discussions in my writings as well, inshallah. Actually, in a way, to be honest, you know, as someone who worked on the proofs for existence of God, I want to say, you know, I agree with that partially. So the Prophet Muhammad was self-evidential, experimental, but also from the outer audiences, you know, there are many features were welcomed by the non-believers. Like, you know, Muhammad al-Amin was not the title given by Muslims, also by larger audience. So I think we have 2 points there. There is a self-evidential part of the Prophet. Someone is claiming, I want to be very careful on this because I'm using kind of the much neutral language, which may, I may not be allowed that. The Prophet is self-evidential in his claim in a way. He says the things, but any rational man who hears that, who hears the Rasulullah Sallam, he is very much close to accept this is the reality. As a Muslim, I accept it. He is the servant of the God, and also he is the prophet of the God. But also in our times, there are so many attacks on those proofs, so many attacks. How do you know this? How can you prove he is the prophet? How can you accept the Quran is the word of God? Of course, these discussions are not new, but I think methodologies are changing as well. Some of them remaining exactly the same, but some of them are changing. So maybe we need to much clarify how he was self-evidently, he was who he was. And also we have to maybe emphasize with other languages or with other sciences, we have to try to bring the proof and demonstrations how one can be truthful in his assertions, how one can be relied on his in his claims. So any claims, generally, historically, I think the ethical claims are much put forwarded. You know, he was a trustworthy man. He was very ethical man. He has, very high ahlak, as a hadith, he was created in the most strong man in ethics. So we may emphasize on those points, but as far as I understand, Colin, I think there are so many lines. I'm trying to parallel this to, there are kind of endless proofs for the existence of God. There are endless proofs he's being unique, he's being the only one. There are many and endless proofs for him, for God. Also, we have almost endless proofs and endless examples, endless demonstrations for the Prophet Muhammad. He is the Prophet. He is the one who has the revelation, who is the one who has the action. So for ordinary man, sometimes we don't, we don't need much evidence. Just we see someone, we have, trust on that issue or assertion, or, we need more proofs, we need more demonstration. So Quran is example for his word. So the other prophets, I'm trying to also emphasize this, there are other proofs. Other prophets prove the Muhammad is the prophet.
Through consensus, yeah.
Kind of, yeah, for consensus, they support each other. This is the one example, for example.
Okay, thank you. There's a saying in Persian, they say, Aftab amad dalila aftab. The sun came, and that is proof of the sun. So the Prophet, ﷺ, is his own proof, in a sense. And you're expanding on that. This is what I wanted to understand. That is the kernel of your paper, is that right?
In my paper, I mentioned many different things, like a love of prophet. So what has got to do with my epistemic justification? For example, I took love of the prophet is also self-evidentially shows that person was rightful. That person was kind of, was the highest guidance, kind of,
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Right, anyone else? Let's have a look. I think some comments. Let's have a look.
Critics, please.
Well, I read the comments. Okay. I am thinking about Udabiyah here, when some left Islam for this point here, what they understood the Prophet to say and the action not immediate happening. It shook even Omar at this point. Do you explore this situation? On the other hand, the case of Abu Bakr, the weight of his faith was based on immediate belief without need of proof of actions. Do you discuss this in relation to Nabi, Sadiq, Mujahid, and Saleh mitigation of this point you make?
Actually, in our last, thank you very much for the contribution and question, actually. I don't want to get into those details in very much. I didn't have that specific point. As far as I remember, this point goes on two occasions. One is for, the say inshallah in the words in the Quran. The Prophet has said the miracle will come, but Allah has warned, and to say inshallah. Say with the will of Allah, it will happen. So this is one of the proof as well. So the Prophet did not make the miracle by himself, as he didn't create the religion himself. So it is not Mohammedanism. The Muhammad didn't have any power to create any miracle. He didn't have any, over control of the issues. And in the second one, I think it was about the Surah Al-Rum. The Persians and the Greek had a fight. Who will win? I think the question is about that. And they didn't know. The Rasulullah ﷺ didn't know when the time of the, when someone will win the battle. But he knew, God has informed him with different ways. Allah has informed him, and he knows only what he was informed. So he knows only what he was given. Also, there are specific incidents, this is the feature of the Prophet, there are different points. I don't know if this was helpful. There are different points how the Prophet has got to know about things, because this is the important, how he knew. Because I knew, I have some non-Muslim chef in the restaurant, and he said, oh, Prophet Muhammad was a good man. He knew why someone shouldn't eat pork, because as a as a chef in the restaurant, he said, because the meat of pork is the lowest value of the meat. So he knew, and he told people not to eat the pork. But I told him, as far as I believe, the Prophet was given this knowledge. So he had this knowledge from the direct knower, all knower. So he delivered this point to other people. So I think being human and Beşer and insan is very classical discussion. The Abduhu ve Rasuluhu, the Prophet was human being. Muslim should remind themselves he was a human being, like anybody, like anyone in everywhere else, but he has guidance and he has education or whatever, we have to expand this. I'm trying to do that as well. What kind of expansion Rasulullah had. So in his expansion of knowledge, he was given the best knowledge by the all omniscient one. So whatever he says, he has the lead to show us. In our times, another problem, if I have a half minute on this, in our times, in the Muslim minds, actually there is a separation. The Prophet, okay, he was a human being like anybody. Of course, he was like anybody, but he was a prophet. So we kind of forget this balance. This balance is the point makes the Islam different than any other religion, any other assertion. So this balance, we believe he was guided, but he was guided rightly by Allah, and in his prophetic guidance, he is the only one. He is the only one. We had the God's talk through him. So we heard the word of God. We heard the Quran from his tongue. So we heard the other words from his tongue in the same ground, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. There's just a short comment, then I think we need to go for break. Saf, from somebody says from Surah Hijr 72. I think that says La Umraka, by your life. Allah's oath by the life of our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
All right, so thanks everyone for being here. It's a pleasure to listen to everybody's presentations. My topic is addressing the question that was actually asked earlier in Bilal's wonderful presentation on is pastoral care something that's new, or is it something that has always existed throughout Islamic history and Islamic tradition? So what I did in the study was focus on modes of transmission of Islamic spiritual care throughout Islamic history to show or to argue that this continuation of the Prophet Muhammad's spiritual teachings has been passed on from generation to generation in different modes. So this is not an exhaustive study of every single mode, but I've provided 3 different modes here as examples. So I'm going to read a compacted part of my paper, which I prepared for this. Okay, somebody wants to come in here. All right. So prophetology is not only an integral element of the Islamic belief system, but it also shapes every aspect of Islamic religious practice. The Prophet Muhammad is believed by Muslims as not only having taught monotheism and ethics, but that his teachings were also infused with a profoundly transformative spirituality that has been transmitted by Muslims throughout generations. From the perspective of spiritual care and chaplaincy, this Muhammadan spirituality has been a framework through which religious meaning has been derived and compassionate lived theologies of Islamic practice have been inspired. A close examination of Prophet Muhammad's teachings as they were preserved in the memories of the early Muslim community reveals a rich source of models of compassion-oriented spiritual care through which Muslim caregivers can root their theologies of caregiving. The Quran describes the essence of Prophet Muhammad's existence as an embodiment of the type of radical compassion that Doring talks about in her book on pastoral care, when the Quran says that the Prophet Muhammad was sent as a mercy for humanity, rahmatan lil alameen. In this spirit, Muslim chaplains find inspiration for a framework for their theologies of spiritual care through embodying the ways in which the Prophet gave spiritual care to his own community. The question we may ask is, if Islam has such a rich philosophy of religious leadership and spiritual care embedded in its own distinct tradition, what were the ways in which these methods of Muhammadan pastoral care were transmitted by Muslims throughout the ages? We find that the Islamic cultural heritage developed a number of mediums through which not only the spirit of Prophet Muhammad's teachings, but the wisdom through which he provided spiritual care has been passed on throughout centuries of Islamic practice. The first mode of transmission of Islamic leadership models is within the gatherings of learning. The term majlis, or sitting, embodies the Muslim perspective of the impact of company on the soul. The companions of the Prophet are known as Sahaba, which comes from the root word Sahaba, which means companionship. This reflects an Islamic worldview that the Prophet's greatest means of transforming those around him was through his ministry of presence. The importance Muslims place on the transformative companionship of the Prophet Muhammad's presence is reflected in the way which the companions, or the Sahaba, were given a distinctive rank within the Muslim community. The medium through which transformation and transmission of the prophetic wisdom was conveyed was through gatherings of learning. In fact, knowledge, learning, and Islamic leadership have consistently intertwined in the Islamic vision of religious leadership. The Prophet Muhammad is cited as having emphasized the foundational nature of learning and knowledge to the Islamic faith in various reports. In one report, the Prophet is said to have stated, "I have been sent as a teacher." إِنِّي بُعِثْتُ مُعَلِّمًا. In another, the Prophet mandated that seeking knowledge is obligatory upon every Muslim male and female. Muslims also note the symbolism behind the first verse being revealed of the Quran, being the verse read. Those who carried, taught, and preserved Islamic knowledge are regarded as more than mere depositories of information. They are considered to inherit the spirituality and ethical teachings of the prophets. Two famous hadiths are indicative of this orientation. The scholars are the inheritors of the prophets, and the scholars of my community are like the prophets of Bani Israel. As a result of this orientation, Muslims have regarded religious authority as inseparable from epistemic authority. In other words, Muslim leadership is perceived as being rooted in religious learning because learning is a formative process in which inward spiritual light is transmitted. And here are some images I've collected of Muslims and learning. And in my longer chapter, I actually also make a comparison with Judaism and its and the place of learning in the rabbinic tradition. Prophetology in Islamic leadership models also extends to the work of Muslim chaplains in healthcare settings. If we regard spiritual leadership as an extension of leadership models emulating the Prophet Muhammad, then the way in which it extends to healthcare chaplaincy is worthy of consideration. A question to consider as more Muslim chaplains become integrated into healthcare spaces is what can Islamic theologies of illness and suffering offer the evolving field of healthcare chaplaincy in the West as it integrates non-Christian traditions and non-Christian cognitive frameworks. We can begin by examining the philosophy behind the way hospitals were structured in the Muslim world before the contemporary period. The architecture of Muslim hospitals and the way in which they functioned reflected distinct theology of illness and spiritual care associated with this. The two most important aspects of this distinction are the way in which illnesses were believed to be contracted and the religious dimension of illness and suffering. In Islamic medicine, wellness was believed to take a holistic form in which the wellness of the body, mind, and soul were interconnected and not mutually exclusive. In other words, disease was not regarded to be caused by spiritual shortcomings such as sin. Similarly, the wellness of the body did not exclude the role of spiritual and mental wellness. Furthermore, distinctions were made in Islamic medicine between mental illness and spiritual illness. Mental illnesses were treated through the construction of structures that took into consideration how space, light, time, and sound impact mental health. Detailed studies of music and their tones, maqams, were developed with theories of how they impact the mind. Music therapy was prevalent in Ottoman hospitals dedicated to the mentally ill, for example. Meanwhile, the recitation of the Quran and other litanies were regarded as means to restore spiritual health. This brings us to a related point regarding Islamic perceptions of illness from a religious perspective. Christian and Muslim theologies of illness and suffering impact the frameworks through which healthcare chaplaincy is practiced by chaplains themselves. For Muslims, a person who is suffering through illness is regarded as in a state of purification from sins and elevation in their connectedness to God. Rather than a theology of guilt in which disease and the diseased are seen as being punished for sins, Muslims regard the ill as being rewarded for every difficulty they endure. Rather than the ill needing prayers from clergy to intervene on behalf of the sinful souls of the sick, as had been the case in early hospitals established in medieval Europe, Muslims perceive those who are suffering to have their veils removed between them and God, and that it is in fact the healthy who are encouraged to seek prayers from those who are undergoing health challenges. Rather than a chaplain visiting to the sick to pray for them, Muslim chaplains visit the sick to pray with them and seek mutual prayers. The Muslim chaplain commonly believes every person who is ill to be a potential saint free of flaws due to God's forgiveness attained through patience with hardship. The Prophet Muhammad is reported to have said in a hadith often cited by Muslims, nothing pricks a believer except that he or she is rewarded. The distinct way in which illnesses are viewed in the Islamic tradition has much to offer the philosophy of healthcare chaplaincy through modeling a religious framework in which the sick are elevated through their being regarded as saintly rather than sinful. The next section I think about is Islamic art as art therapy. These are bimaristan or Muslim hospitals, famous images of Islamic medicine and pharmacology. Islamic art as art therapy. Art has always been an integral element of spiritual formation for Muslims throughout many centuries and vast geographic centers. Muslims often cite the prophetic tradition, God is beautiful and loves beauty, as one of the many ways in which Islamic scripture has inspired Muslims to create Islamic art. Another verse from the Quran states that who exalts the monuments of God, then it is a result of the piety that is in the hearts. The way this verse juxtaposes spiritual piety within one's heart to be manifested in the way such an individual of spiritual depth treats objects that are connected to God is a significant reminder of the impetus behind Islamic civilization's intricate attention given to the perfection of Islamic monuments and their ornamentation. Each element of Islamic architecture conveys spiritual significance to the faithful. Exposure of the senses to the outward beautification of religious symbols is believed to beautify the soul through its beauty. Peace, symmetry, and majesty are common themes of Islamic architecture throughout vast geographic regions of the Muslim world. Gardens are divided into the familiar four-sectional components that are designed to bring tranquility to the soul and remind one of God's wonders. Natural beauty is exhibited in the trees and flowers which ornament Islamic gardens. They merge cultural histories of these gardens with the Islamic faith. They're infusing new meanings in the simple pleasures of gazing upon select fauna that is structured in patterns that dazzle the eye. Such gardens have become rooted into the arts of Islam and can be found in regions ranging from Morocco through Iran, through Central Asia and India. Art therapy has become an increasingly prevalent mode of self-care in recent decades. In a shift away from commonly held perceptions shaped by Cartesian models of valuing art for its final product without significant attention to its means of production, art therapy has been adopted as a method of spiritual care and healing by an increasing number of therapists, counselors, and mental health professionals. Among the benefits of art therapy have been said to regulate blood pressure and heart, as well as increase self-esteem and help deal with depression. The Canadian Counseling and Psychotherapy Association writes in this article, The Psychological Benefits of Art Therapy. Art therapy is used with children, adolescents, adults, older adults, groups, families, veterans, and people with chronic health issues to assess and treat the following: anxiety, depression, and other mental and emotional problems, substance abuse and addiction, family and relationship issues, abuse and domestic violence, social and emotional difficulties related to disability and illness, trauma and loss, physical, cognitive, and neurological problems, and psychosocial difficulties related to medical illness. While art therapy or the focus on the process of creating art to uplift the soul and facilitate mental health is relatively new in the West, it has been an integral element of the spiritual formation within the wisdom traditional societies of the East. A prime example of this can be found in the history of the practice of calligraphy in Muslim societies. Calligraphy is an art form that is passed on through apprenticeship through a teacher and student relationship. Much like the process of knowledge transmission discussed earlier, or chains of spiritual transmission, silsilas of Sufi paths, the art of calligraphy is also passed on through a chain of transmission known as an isnad. Also parallel to models of Islamic spirituality found in Sufi traditions is the centrality of the personal affinity or munasaba between the calligraphy master and student of calligraphy before they set out on what is a lifelong relationship of mentorship through the vehicle of producing calligraphy.
5 minutes for you, is that right?
Okay, all right, thanks. In other words, a teacher may reject or accept a student based on this affinity that they sense for the students. The ability of a student of calligraphy to succeed is also dependent upon her or his love and affinity for the calligraphy master, in which in turn will give them the capacity to undergo a long and arduous process of apprenticeship. This completion of one's training in calligraphy is marked with being granted a certificate known as an ijaza. This once again parallels the ijazas granted in Islamic sciences such as hadith, Quranic recitation, theology, etc. In this similarity, we find that both learning and art share the same results of character formation through the process of transmission, spiritual transmission, that is traced in the ijaza. The process of learning to produce and later producing calligraphy itself is central to value of this art form in Muslim societies. The first piece of writing every novice in the Ottoman calligraphic tradition begins with is the phrase, Rabbi yassir wa la tu'assir, Rabbi tammim bil khair, which means, my Lord, make it easy and not difficult. My Lord, help me complete this in goodness. The novice will begin by writing this phrase over and over day and night for an entire week before presenting her work to her teacher. The master will inevitably find numerous imperfections that only the fine eye of the master calligrapher can detect. The practice draft will be marked to show where the novice has erred, and she will go back and spend the rest of the week all day, every day practicing. This kind of dedication and perseverance to perfect one's calligraphic penmanship cultivates spiritual discipline where one is forcing their mind to focus and stay with a task for long hours despite boredom and frustration. With the practice of overcoming these feelings, the novice builds within himself the capacity to control emotions and distractions. This in turn cultivates another spiritual strength in the form of mindfulness. Through controlling one's desires in long hours of practice, one eventually becomes in control of their nafs, or their lower selves, that are averse to silence and long hours of perseverance with a pen and paper. Thus, in mastering the pen, the calligrapher learns to master her soul. The phrasing is also significant in that this phrase is that the first phrase that the novice will repeat maybe thousands of times before moving on to anything else is one that ingrains in the mind and the soul of the writer that success and failure ultimately come from God and not one's own talents. This realization, along with the willingness to submit to a teacher and be corrected in one's writing, has another impact on the spiritual formation of the calligrapher, and this is namely the cultivation of humility. It is only one who has mastery over one's ego and who can accept instruction and correction who can one day be worthy of leading others. This is akin to other ancient wisdoms of the East that can be found that found their way into popular culture, for example, in the form of the Karate Kid trilogy, where Mr. Miyagi starts Daniel's training with practicing to wax on and wax off while cleaning cars. When Daniel is frustrated after doing this for a week and believing it has nothing to do with karate instruction, he is taught a lesson by his teacher who makes him see that before mastering the art of karate, or perhaps chaplaincy, Daniel must master his nafs through hours of boring manual labor. Through this silent, repetitive exercise, Daniel cultivates an inner awareness of his own soul that then becomes essential for his maintaining posture and control during the karate finals. This is a part of the perennial wisdom of the East that Muslim societies shared through the ages. Muslims that produced breathtaking masterpieces of art and architecture did so with the belief that living in beauty and creating beauty results in the beautification of the soul. Bilal Badat is a scholar who writes about the process of the making of a master calligrapher. His work highlights the relationship between what he refers to as character, craft, and aesthetic cultural production. Having been through the lengthy process of learning from the foremost calligraphy masters of our time and acquiring an ijaza, Vedat notes the primary role that character formation played in his learning process. Furthermore, he states that his teacher explicitly stated that he would not grant an ijaza to a person of foul character, such as a liar. This type of formation of character and the consideration of character and the decision to grant one a license of proficiency in the form of ijaza is a significant distinguishing trait of the forms of apprenticeship in the Islamic tradition that emphasizes the process and the moral fortitude of individuals seeking to learn. While calligraphy has been detailed here, the above-mentioned principles apply to an array of Islamic crafts such as ceramics, woodworking, and illumination. This was historically the rationale behind the emphasis that each person in the Muslim community used to be expected to have a craft they mastered. Spiritual care or pastoral care as it manifested in the Protestant tradition is also one that was originally based on apprenticeship, in which one acquired the skills of pastoral care through shadowing a skilled pastor. Clinical pastoral education also functions on this foundation, in which a supervisor is called to mentor new chaplains in training through mirroring for them appropriate pastoral skills. The study above highlights that this form of spiritual formation is not one which is new to the Islamic tradition, but rather integral to the foundations and spread of Islam throughout its social history. And that's all my presentation.
Fantastic. So yeah, thank you for that. Unfortunately, if we take up Mr. Miyagi's wax on, wax off these days of children, you get done for child exploitation. But but let's open the floor to any questions or comments, Miyagi included.
I have a comment.
Yeah, Colin. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you so much, Ferial. Thank you so much. It was wonderful, absolutely wonderful. I think you've captured the very heart of the matter, so to speak. You know, our pastoral theological wing is basically about stressing the importance of the continuity of prophethood, and I use that phrase guardedly, the continuity of prophethood in the sense of inculcating the divine message through theology and through chaplaincy. I think you've captured that perfectly in this. And I really do look forward to reading the whole chapter. You've gone to the very heart of the matter. I think you've vindicated our choice of actually having a pastoral wing to our project. And you've certainly vindicated our choice of scholar
thank you.
To represent that side. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Colin. That's really kind of you.
Oh, I'd like to bring in a good friend of mine, Dr. Jason Welly, all the way from Rome. Jason, ahlan wa sahlan.
شكرا لك ولكم كلكم. Thank you very much, Dr. Ferial, for this very stimulating presentation. I don't know if I have a question. I'll frame it as a comment, if I may, along anthropological lines, because you had me I'm a Catholic priest, and you had me thinking about my clinical pastoral education when I went through that process of internship. And I remember doing it with a mixed group where I was the only Catholic. Most were training for Protestant churches, as well as a couple Jews training for the rabbinate. And I remember our Lutheran instructor for the department trying hard to drill it into everyone that the patients are hardwired to ask the chaplain to pray for them. You know, that this it's not distinctly of a Catholic theological move. I remember him framing it in anthropological terms, that you chaplains, whether you like it or not, whether you think it's your role or not, human beings are hardwired to ask the clergy to pray for them. And I just wonder if you have any reaction to that, because it was something that we always found ourselves trying to grapple with in the context of patient care. And thank you for your presentation.
Oh, thanks for your question, Jason. This reminds me of my own CPE experience when I was doing CPE at Stanford in 2014. As a Muslim, to me, it was natural that I would ask the patient, let's pray together or pray for me. And then when I came back with my group, others in my group thought that was so strange. And I said, why? They said, well, that's why we're chaplains. That's why. And I said, what does that mean? They said, well, that's why we're ordained. And I said, well, Muslims don't have ordainments. How do you know that the person who's ill is not in a higher state with their Lord than me? Of course, I'm going to ask them to pray. It's an opportunity for me as much as it is for them. And, being a Muslim chaplain, in a setting in which there were few Muslims in the hospital, it also then opened doors for me to speak to people and to be able to serve in the hospital in that way as well, that I wasn't coming to pray for them, I was coming to talk to them, with them if that's what they wanted.
Anyone with a comment or a question?
I think we lost our questioner, didn't we? Did we? Oh no, he's still there. Right.
Okay. I think.
May I go?
Ismail Hoxha, yeah, please.
Thank you very much, Feryal. It's been great. Thank you very much for the also presentation and the great pictures. But you brought all good pictures, nice pictures. Just it reminded me something. Actually, I have come across in recent years about rock writings in Saudi Arabia, around the North Saudi Arabia, Arabia. Some hadiths written or carved on the rocks. Some verses are carved on the walls. Are you familiar on this one? They are quite different than what you have shown us. But I remember this actually about writing. It's Rasulullah Sallam's command to write as well, the writing of the verses, writing of his words as well. So they have written in various places, and the rocks are very interesting for me. But also I think there's a specific emphasis about writing, to beautify the words in different shapes and and ways. How would you think about that? As a prophetic wisdom to get healed by writing, by itself, and by the message, by the all those others. Thank you very much. Thank you. It's been great to see you, by the way.
Yeah, good to see you too, Ismail. So perhaps the earliest writings on rocks were just ways of preserving the scripture and the sayings of the prophet. But with time, very early on, we see with the Kufic script and all of these different scripts that develop, that beautifying that writing is something that is ingrained in Muslim societies. And this is from the concept, I think, فَمَنْ يُعَظِّمْ شَعَائِرِ اللَّهِ فَإِنَّهَا مِنْ تَقْوَى الْقُلُوبِ. Whoever exalts the signs of God, that it's from the taqwa, the piety that's in the hearts. And so everything that Muslims did was beautiful because it beautified the soul. It also showed the value that they gave to things that represented God and Islam.
May I add one small question?
Yes, yes.
The development of scriptures, as it is, asserted that, script against scriptures.
Script against scripture, yeah. So, I mean, I guess what you're referring to is the preservation of the Quran being primarily orally in our tradition.
Mm-hmm. And also, Muslims didn't get much involved about making sculptures, sculptures, I can say, heykel, hayakil.
Okay, yeah, yes, sculptures, yes. So
Against sculptures to
yes.
express feelings and express ideas, express messages through script, not the scriptures.
Oh, that's beautiful. I never thought of the two dichotomies in that way, but that's a really beautiful way of expressing that, scriptures versus sculptures. Yeah. And that's probably really a distinction you'd find between Islamic communities and Middle Eastern Christian communities living side by side, was one emphasizes scriptural beauty or scriptural art, the other one sculptural art. Yeah, I've never thought about that. I might use that with your permission somewhere. Maybe even incorporate it into the chapter.
So first of all, let me say, I thank you for that. The second thing about the scripture and the sculptor, the kalak and the character, that dichotomy, pops to mind. But anyway, back to your presentation. You raise Doring, and Doring's work was my problem. She problematized this my whole push, because in Doring's work, she makes the claim that Islam is in the boat with the Hindus and the Buddhists, who do not have a pastoral care like like a tradition. And she squarely says that, and she double downs on for her first edition, and then in her second edition, she states the same thing. And her goal is to move towards this cultural like a theology, which centers the identity of people. And so you have this kind of very porous like a theology, and it's a really subtle way, I think, at undermining our tradition, particularly the prophethood, centering. And so that's why I see Doring as a problem.
Yes, I 100% agree. I finished the book for a class I'm teaching at the Chicago Div School. That's the main text, but Doring does not understand Islam. And every reference she makes, it's offensive. So I did see that particular section, and I have it all scratched up and lined up. But I think that the response to her arguments, in my opinion, are insufficient, in that rather than deconstructing the Christocentricity of her claims and the white supremacy that is embedded within the claims, this idea of progress. And so the most progressive religion is Christianity, and let's bring in Judaism too, since, we want to do that. So only Jews and Christians have pastoral care. Everyone else has spiritual care. I would approach this by deconstructing her approach altogether. And from your presentation, what I heard with this debate between whether we use the term spiritual or pastoral care, I saw three arguments that are conflated. One is this really problematic claim made by Doring herself, and that is that Muslims don't have pastoral care, that Islam is, and she mentions later in the book as well, Islam is a, what does she say, like qada, qadar, deterministic religion, and doesn't finish what she's implying there. But the other two is conflating two other arguments. So within Christianity, there is a debate between spiritual and pastoral care, with Christians saying that by focusing on spiritual care, we're de-emphasizing Christianity by Christians. And then within the Muslim community, I see the debate being not over whether there is such a thing as pastoral care of the prophet or not. I've never heard anybody say that, but whether we want to adopt Christian or Protestant models of caring for others, and then incorporate Islam into that. So these are three very different arguments. And what I saw between my presentation, or my usage of spiritual care and your usage of pastoral care, and if you notice I use them interchangeably as well, it's really semantics, in that we mean the same thing, but we're differing over how and when we use them. When I'm talking to Christians, I emphasize the term pastoral care, just to put in their mind that Muslims have that. But when I'm talking to perhaps a predominantly Muslim gathering, I don't mind using spiritual care more than pastoral care, just because of the Christocentricity that's implied. And one last point, like within the word pastoral is also the word pastor, but we don't say imamic care or rabbinic care, even though the other religions would also say imam means to lead. Why not say imamic care? Rabbinic, you know, a rabbi is a teacher. Why not? Why can't Muslims say rabbinic care? But there's something where we're okay with using a term that has embedded in it Christian leadership. There's a Christocentricity that is implied that we don't challenge. So that's really what I'm challenging, not that the Prophet didn't interact pastorally with his companions and teach that. But I think someone needs to respond to Doring, but I don't think the responses have been sufficient today. Yeah, because they don't deconstruct Doring. Yeah, yes.
Any closing thoughts to wrap up, or should we just? What is it? I mean, I found it fantastic.
Sap, you're the chairman. If you have any closing thoughts, please.
I just want to say this has been brilliant for me. You know, I'm scrambling, writing things down, jotting things, my own thoughts developing as I'm listening to everyone.
Jason asked me if I was a TA at U Chicago. Yes, when I was a graduate student. Were you there, Jason? You were a student there then.
Yes, you taught me.
Yes.
You only had one really strange monk in your class. That was me.
Okay. Yeah. No, I don't remember who it was, but I do remember there was a monk in the class. I was a PhD student. Yeah.
Brilliant. You see, full circle. We're connected. We're all connected. Alhamdulillah. I mean, I don't know. I really enjoyed it today, and I'm so happy, you know, enriched by this session. And let's roll on tomorrow, inshallah.
Thanks for chairing it, Saf.
No, thank you. Thank you all.
And to Mashid for chairing this morning as well.
Yes.
Thank you very much to everyone.